The year is 1495, and the world is living a betrayal. The light of the Renaissance, we are told, was a sudden miracle, an awakening from 1,000-year darkness. That is the lie the Church buried. Listen closely, for the truth is far more damning. Deep beneath the opulent splendor of the Vatican, in a vault sealed not with iron, but with forbidden theological fear, lay a collection of texts. They were not merely philosophical musings. They were the blueprints. The repeatable, terrifyingly efficient mathematical code for an industrial age. Devices that could have purified water for every peasant, printed books for every child, and driven ships against the wind. But the popes saw this knowledge not as salvation, but as a curse. They feared that if mankind could command nature through science, the miracle of faith would die. And so, in a calculated, methodical act of moral decay, they chose fire. They burned the blueprints for a better world, condemning Europe to centuries of stagnation and poverty. This is the secret of the Renaissance. It was not a sudden birth of light, but a desperate, murderous act of suppression. This is the truth the Church buried in the very foundation of its power, the truth we now exhume in the quiet of this night. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We are not in the grand halls of St. Peter's, but in the forgotten, low ceiling sub-vaults, places even the cardinals preferred not to remember. Here the air is cold, thick with the dust of centuries, and the only illumination comes from a single sputtering candle. Imagine the texture of the stone beneath your hand, rough, cold, built to last an eternity. This is the place where the Church's greatest sin of omission was executed, and where the first clue to that sin now rests. Our journey begins with a relic of failure, a remnant found not among the Vatican's glorious treasures, but among its discarded remnants. It is a lump, a small, strange, fused mass of metal and parchment, no larger than the palm of your hand, discovered in the process of clearing a forgotten subterranean storage space known, ironically, as the Deposition Misericordias, the deposit of mercy. To the casual observer, it is merely detritus, proof of a centuries-old fire, perhaps an accidental blaze in a poorly ventilated corner. But look closer, and the narrative begins to unravel. The metal is not common iron or even standard Renaissance bronze. When analyzed decades ago, under conditions of the deepest secrecy, it showed traces of highly refined industrial alloys. Alloys that should not have existed until the late 18th century. It is an artifact screaming 1,000-year anachronism. And fused to this metal is the parchment, blackened, brittle, yet legible under magnification. A single, small diagram remains. It is not an image of a saint, nor a philosophical doodle. It is a geometric drawing of immense complexity, a series of interlocking cogs and pistons arranged in a pattern that an expert later recognized as a blueprint for a repeating kinetic engine, a motor capable of running on steam or pressurized water, something utterly impossible for the time. This small, black lump is the ashes of the Archimedes Code. It is the physical, surviving evidence of a vast library, a complete technological lineage stretching back to the great engineers of the Hellenistic and Byzantine eras, which the Church gathered, analyzed, and systematically purified through the use of fire. They did not destroy the books simply because they were pagan. They destroyed them because they were true. Think of the scene. Picture the men in the shadows of the flickering candlelight, wearing the heavy robes of the Curia. They are not mindless zealots. They are brilliant, Latin-speaking scholars, the intellectual elite of the age. They understand the mathematics on that parchment. They grasp the potential power in that fused lump of metal. And it is this very understanding that terrified them into action. What does it mean for the structure of society if a peasant, merely by following a series of repeatable written steps, can achieve what was previously attributed only to divine grace or an unrepeatable miracle? The core of the Papal States. Power was its position as the sole mediator between God and man. Their power was built on the mystery of God's will, the unpredictability of fate, and the necessity of prayer. An invention like a machine that could pump water to every village, or a press that could print books for every commoner, stripped them of that essential mystery. It offered proof of a mechanistic God, one who built the universe with knowable, understandable rules that man could potentially master. This was the profound fear, the fear of the clockwork God. The decision was not made by a solitary madman, but by a chillingly rational committee. They enacted a policy that was not called destruction, but the ritual of the sacred flame, a campaign of ritualistic purification to rid Europe of knowledge too great for the current moral constitution of man. Imagine the scholars forced to categorize the knowledge they were about to erase. They would separate the harmless philosophy from the dangerous mathematics, the innocent literature from the explicit engineering. They would handle the very pages that held the formula for modern metallurgy, the secrets of advanced lens grinding, the calculations for ballistic trajectory knowledge that would have saved thousands of lives in medicine and millions more in agriculture. And then, under the quiet gaze of the Roman night, they would feed the pages to the sacred flame. Can you hear the whisper of the ancient paper as it turns to ash? Can you smell the acrid, metallic smoke that lingered in the deepest chambers of the Vatican, a silent witness to a millennia of human progress being purposefully undone? The true depth of the deception lies in how they covered their tracks. They didn't just burn the texts, they rewrote history itself. The texts that survived were deliberately altered. The specific functional equations were replaced with dense, allegorical religious poetry. The blueprints were disguised as esoteric, confusing geometric designs within the margins of seemingly innocuous prayer books. They became the ciphers of the hidden index, hidden in plain sight, ensuring that if they were ever discovered, they would be dismissed as mystical. Unworkable superstition. The architects, the artists, the very thinkers of the Renaissance were forced to perpetuate the lie. Consider the case of the chief Vatican architect, a man who designed the complex hydrostatic systems of the city. He used the advanced, forbidden principles he learned from the suppressed texts to build his wonders, but when asked to credit his genius, he was forced to publicly ascribe his success to a sudden, divine inspiration, a miraculous revelation from God. His silent confession of the truth remains unwritten in the stones of Rome itself. The terror was not just spiritual. It was deeply pragmatic. The popes knew that a technologically advanced, self-sufficient populace was a populace they could not control. Poverty bred dependence on the Church's charity and authority. Ignorance ensured belief in the unexplainable. Therefore, the calculated stagnation of the West was an act of political self-preservation, cloaked in the robes of theological necessity. This quiet, continuous act of intellectual sabotage went on for decades, perhaps centuries. It was a secret agreement, an unspoken pact among the College of Cardinals, who convinced themselves that they were acting for the ultimate salvation of mankind. They believed that by deliberately holding humanity back, they were sparing its soul from the moral corruption that sudden, materialistic knowledge might bring. The chilling question remains, how much human suffering, how many plagues, famines, and unnecessary hardships were the direct result of that one calculated decision to burn the books? We are searching through the ashes of the Archimedes Code not for ancient gold, but for the lost potential of our own history. This quiet, continuous act of intellectual sabotage went on for decades, perhaps centuries. It was a secret agreement, an unspoken pact among the College of Cardinals, who convinced themselves that they were acting for the ultimate salvation of mankind. They believed that by deliberately holding humanity back, they were sparing its soul from the moral corruption that sudden, materialistic knowledge might bring. The chilling question remains, how much human suffering, how many plagues, famines, and unnecessary hardships were the direct result of that one calculated decision to burn the books? We are searching through the ashes of the Archimedes Code not for ancient gold, but for the lost potential of our own history. We look at the tiny, fused lump of metal, and we see not just a fragment of an old manuscript, but the ghost of the steam-powered age. We see the shadows of mass-produced medicine, the clarity of lenses that could have cured blindness, and the silent gears of machines that could have ended the backbreaking toil of serfdom centuries before it finally faded. Think about the individual tragedy of the engineers themselves. They were not heretics seeking power. They were thinkers seeking efficiency. They were the spiritual descendants of Archimedes, driven by the pure, calm logic of mathematics. We know from scattered, unreliable sources from the private diaries of conflicted patrons that these innovators were often lured into the Vatican's orbit under the pretense of high patronage. They were flattered, their genius admired, and their calculations meticulously copied and studied. Then the silence would descend. The patron would suddenly fall ill. The workshop would suffer an unfortunate fire, or the innovator himself would be quietly retired to a secluded monastery. Stripped of his research and forbidden to speak of his work under threat of excommunication. Imagine the final days of one such man, an engineer from Milan whose name is now lost to us, recorded only as Magister Ignis, Master of Fire, in a single obscure document. He was celebrated for developing an early, powerful system of hydraulic measurement. He was convinced he would revolutionize the water supply of Rome. Instead, he was taken to a secluded villa outside the city walls. Day after day, a trusted scribe would visit, offering him the finest food and wine, but constantly asking him to repeat his calculations, to explain his principles, and to draw his final, most complete schematics. He believed he was contributing to the Church's great work. But the day he delivered his final treatise, the complete, bound volume of his life's work, he was offered a cup of ceremonial wine, a drink of gratitude from the Holy Father. The next morning he was found peacefully deceased, a look of profound, serene confusion on his face. The official cause was recorded as a divine calling. The hidden cause was a sophisticated, untraceable Roman poison, administered under the guise of piety. And what of the scribe who took the notes? He was not a murderer, but a moral accomplice without blood on his hands. He was a dedicated servant of the Church, told that this work was necessary to prevent a spiritual collapse far worse than any physical death. He would spend the rest of his life meticulously transcribing the forbidden knowledge, not to use it, but to hide it, to change the labels, to adjust the decimal points, to inoculate the knowledge against replication. He was tasked with destroying the functional truth of the texts, not by fire, but by systematic, intelligent corruption. He knew the potential of the knowledge he held and the cost of the lie he helped weave. Can you imagine the solitude of that man, spending his days surrounded by proof of a better future, knowing he was the primary agent preventing it? This internal conflict, this poison of pragmatism, was the true moral decay of the Renaissance papacy. They were surrounded by beauty, commissioning Michelangelo to paint a perfect ceiling that celebrated the genius of God and man, while simultaneously orchestrating the murder of real, tangible genius in the shadowy back alleys of Europe. The beauty they fostered was a distraction, a shimmering illusion to draw the eye away from the darkness they were actively cultivating. The cover-up extended even into the most sacred spaces. When a young, overly zealous cardinal proposed an initiative to translate ancient medical texts that contained sophisticated knowledge of sanitation, knowledge that could have ended the cycles of plague, the proposal was swiftly, quietly dismissed. The reason given was lack of funds. The true reason, sanitation systems, clean water, and the end of plague would reduce the flock's reliance on the church for spiritual intervention during times of crisis. The disease itself, tragically, was viewed as a stabilizing political asset. Even the architecture of the Vatican itself began to reflect the lie. The architects, using their forbidden knowledge, built complex, hidden hydraulic systems and perfect ventilation that kept the Pope and the Curia safe and healthy. Yet, outside the Vatican walls, the Roman populace suffered in squalor. The pristine perfection of the Holy City became a silent testament to the Church's calculated hypocrisy. A fortress of engineered health standing untouched amid the chaos of disease. We see this hypocrisy most starkly in the remnants of a document labeled the Treaty of the False Miracle. It outlines a proposal, never formally enacted but widely practiced, where the papacy would only sanction technological advancements that were so complex and difficult to understand that the common man would automatically assume they were the result of divine intervention. Simple, repeatable, democratizing technology was to be suppressed. Complex, rare, and theatrical technology was to be encouraged, as it reinforced the Church's narrative of being the sole purveyor of extraordinary knowledge. This suppression was never a secret to all. High-ranking cardinals, those who entered the conclave, had to pass through a hidden understanding, a chilling, silent agreement that this great lie was for the greater moral good. They had to accept that the temporary stagnation of man's progress was the necessary price for the eternal salvation of his soul. But one question haunts the empty spaces of the Vatican archive, a question that connects this lost knowledge directly to the great libraries of the past. It is the question of lineage. Were the popes merely destroying new work, or were they continuing an ancient tradition? They say that when the great library of Alexandria burned centuries before, it was a tragedy born of war and chaos. But the papacy, with its access to ancient histories, knew the full truth of that devastating loss. They knew that the Alexandrian scholars had also touched upon a certain repeatable, dangerous knowledge. The echoes of Alexandria suggested that the loss was not entirely accidental, but perhaps the final, desperate act of a dying civilization, trying to contain a truth it could not handle. Did the Renaissance popes see themselves as the new guardians of this dangerous truth, merely continuing the ancient, morally flawed duty of controlling the flow of human potential? This thought is far more terrifying than simple corruption, suggesting a generational curse in institution forever trapped by the belief that ignorance is the only path to spiritual safety. Let your mind drift now to the blueprint hidden in the fresco. In one of the less-known corridors of the Vatican, beneath a layer of later paint, a faint undersketch remains. It is a beautiful celestial map, depicting the gears of the heavens. But careful analysis reveals that the geometry of the gears, the ratios, the placement, the complex motion is impossibly precise for the era. It is not a map of the heavens. It is the schematic for a clockwork device of unimaginable sophistication. A piece of the forbidden knowledge rendered in public view, disguised as divine art. A final, poetic arrogance. The popes displayed the truth of what they had burned, knowing that no one would ever see past the beauty and the blessing to recognize the mechanical principle concealed within. This calculated, centuries-long suppression defined the period we call the Dark Ages and shaped the hesitant pace of the Renaissance. The moral decay of the supposed savior, is complete when the salvation of the soul is valued higher than the preservation of life itself. The popes went to their rest believing they were heroes, not murderers. Saviors, not saboteurs. Their sleep and the weight of the lay must have been heavy. Lying in their papal apartments, listening to the city outside, the coughs of the sick, the sounds of manual labor, the fearful cries during a plague, they knew the quiet, terrible truth. They had the power to stop the suffering with a single decree, but chose the silence of control instead. And so we leave this first chamber, but the air still carries the lingering scent of that ancient smoke. The library may be full now, but the fire that still burns in the library's shadow is the lingering absence of all that was lost. It is the quiet horror that the greatest obstacle to our progress was not chaos or ignorance, but a single, powerful institution's calculated fear of losing control. The ashes of the ancient world were cold, yet the church feared the embers. We spoke of the burning, the great, calculated crime of the Renaissance popes who destroyed the blueprints for an early industrial revolution, but a burning leaves no witnesses. The real betrayal was recorded in silent permanence. Deep within the Vatican archives, hidden among routine financial reports, are specific ledgers detailing the massive, unexplained costs of purification rites and waste disposal. These documents, stamped with the sign of the Officium Securitas Scripturae, the Office of Scriptural Security, are marked by an unnerving, consistent anomaly, a streak of vivid red ink. This crimson stain is not just a ledger error. It is the secret code of a heartbroken man. It is the visible lie that covers the systematic, decades-long erasure of the truth. The red ink marks the pages where the church recorded the cost of its greatest act of moral decay. Knowing every florin spent was a price paid to keep humanity weak, this is the truth the church buried. Recorded in the tears of the man who could not stop it. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the heat of the burning chamber to the cold, obsessive calm of the counting house. Imagine a small, airless room high in the apostolic palace, far from the grand papal libraries. In this room sits the scribe, his fingers stained with ink, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of knowledge. He is merely an accountant, a record keeper, yet he holds the true key to the conspiracy. He is Brother Thomas, and the vivid red ink on his fingers is the same crimson that stains the ledgers. The scribe's tears and the red ink are inseparable. Brother Thomas. He was not a cardinal nor an assassin, but a man of meticulous order and profound, agonizing intellectual honesty. His life was devoted to numbers, to the elegant balance of debits and credits that defined the Church's vast temporal empire. His quiet sanctuary, however, was invaded by a terrible new category of expense, the purification rites. Under the instruction of the highest-ranking Curia officials, Thomas was tasked with meticulously recording every florin spent on the systematic destruction of the forbidden texts. It was not a simple tally. It was a bureaucratic nightmare designed to mask a moral crime. The expenses were labeled cryptically: Alia Sancti Ignis, oils for the holy fire; Crematio Scripturae Vetustas, cremation of ancient writings; and the most chilling of all, Dispositio Maxima Waste, disposal of maximum waste. Thomas understood that waste disposal meant the burning of knowledge. But why the meticulous accounting? Why not simply sweep the evidence away? Because the Vatican, even in its greatest moral crime, was compelled by its own internal logic to maintain financial accountability. The funds were enormous, vast fortunes redirected from charity and war funds. The cost of destroying a single, large volume of Byzantine mathematics was sometimes higher than funding a small war. The scribe was forced to become the chronicler of the conspiracy. Every entry was a dagger twist, a reminder of the brilliance that was being systematically erased. He would calculate the cost of the fire itself, the specific woods, the ritualistic oils, the salaries of the silent, cloaked workers who fed the furnace. Then he would calculate the opportunity cost, the gold that could have fed the poor or funded a hospital, diverted instead to pay for global ignorance. He sought a silent, personal protest, a way to scream the truth onto the page without ever writing a word that could be labeled heresy. And so he devised his private code, a mournful whisper known only to him, the red ink. Most Vatican ledgers of the time used black ink for standard expenses and green for high-value assets. But Thomas began to reserve a specific shade of crimson ink, a rare dye derived from a highly toxic, unstable mineral, for only two purposes. First, recording any expenditure related to the purification rites. And second, noting any payment made to the spies and agents, referred to as custodes, silentium guardians of silence, who located the remaining texts across Europe. The red ink became the blood of the conspiracy. It marked the pages where the Church's spiritual duty clashed violently with its political ambition. When a large sum was paid to a merchant in Venice for the acquisition and transfer of sacred relics, but was marked with the ominous red stain, Thomas knew the truth. The merchant was not acquiring relics, but confiscating a mechanical treatise from a German monastery. The scribe's hands, stained by the toxic pigment, became a physical symbol of his own moral contamination. The tears that fell onto the ledger sheets were not just for the lost knowledge, but for his own complicity. He realized that by meticulously recording the crime, he was ensuring its perfect cover-up. If the red ink was ever questioned, his prepared, plausible explanation was ready. It is merely a new, experimental dye for important capital expenditures. Your Eminence. The lie was perfect in its simplicity. The weight of this silent knowledge began to crush Brother Thomas. He walked the candlelit corridors of the Vatican, an invisible ghost amidst the pomp of the papal court. Every joyous feast, every celebratory procession, every display of the Church's magnificent wealth was tainted for him by the memory of the red ink entries. He knew the source of that gold was not piety, but the successful destruction of a rival, technologically advanced future. His inner conflict manifested in small, obsessive details within his work. Look closely at the surviving ledgers attributed to the Office of Scriptural Security. Beside the major entries, beside the massive sums paid for the Dispositio Maxima Waste, Thomas began to leave a series of cryptic footnotes. These were not full sentences, but abbreviations in tiny, illegible symbols that only a mind trained in esoteric logic could decode. One such footnote, often found nestled beneath the date, is the symbol for the alchemical element of sulfur, a simple cross above a triangle. In classical alchemy, sulfur represented the principle of combustibility and the soul. For Thomas, it represented the soul of knowledge lost to fire. When he marked an expense with this symbol, he was silently recording that the knowledge destroyed on that day was of immense, irreplaceable value, a true technological masterpiece. Not merely a philosophical treatise. Another symbol, found consistently next to payments to agents, was the inverted Vesica Piscis, the ancient overlapping circle symbol. The Vesica Piscis symbolized truth and the intersection of worlds. Inverting it was Thomas's way of marking the entry as a treason against truth. It was the scribe's tears translated into geometry. He was logging in a private language the moral quality of the church's expenditure. His most telling protest, however, lay in the dating system. All official Vatican ledgers used the standard Gregorian calendar, but Thomas began cross-referencing every purification rite entry with a meticulous, private calendar based on seasonal agrarian cycles. He would note, expense incurred during the time of the first sowing, or payment made during the time of the autumn harvest. This seemingly innocent habit held a profound meaning. The knowledge that the church was actively burning the advanced irrigation, soil mechanics, and agricultural technology could have revolutionized those very sowing and harvest seasons, ending the constant famine that haunted Europe. By linking the destruction of the knowledge to the natural cycle, it could have transformed. Thomas created a chronology of betrayal, a constant, silent accusation against his masters. The burden on him was immense. He was forced to maintain the facade of normalcy, to politely deliver his ledgers to the stern, powerful cardinals, knowing they were receiving a financial report of a world-altering crime. He would stand there, perhaps, as a cardinal idly flipped through the pages, his thumb running over the vivid red ink, completely oblivious to the symbolic weight and the hidden tears woven into the sulfur, and the inverted geometry dot. Can you imagine the terror and the anguish of that moment? The heart pounding, the eyes desperately trying to convey the truth without moving the lips. Yet the cardinals saw only numbers, only evidence of a successful, necessary suppression that protected their temporal power. They saw the red ink and assumed, as Thomas had prepared them to, that it signified high-level capital expenditure, the price of maintaining stability. They completely missed that it was the literal cost of human suffering. Thomas understood the true, terrifying nature of his role. He wasn't just recording the crime, he was sanitizing it. He was giving the church the perfect bureaucratic shield, a complete, rational, financially sound explanation for every coin spent on darkness. His exquisite precision was the final lock on the vault of the conspiracy. The scribe's ledgers occasionally offer a fleeting glimpse of the victims of this terrible policy. Among the records of special acquisitions are disbursements made to secure the silence or the ultimate removal of key figures. One entry, marked with the most extreme use of the red ink and the sulfur symbol, details a final payment made in the town of Ferrara, just after the sudden disappearance of Magister Ignis, the Master of Fire. This engineer, whom we touched upon briefly, had done more than just dream of a water pump. He had perfected a system of ceramic filtration and closed-loop hydraulic power that would have ended the cycle of waterborne diseases that ravaged Renaissance cities every summer. Imagine his workshop. Not a place of mystical potions, but a clean, orderly space filled with diagrams, precise clay molds, and gears turned on early lathes. He had solved the problem of urban sanitation centuries before the rest of Europe. He was offering the gift of public health independence, the idea that the population could control its own destiny, free from the plague cycles that the Church often framed as divine punishment. This was his unforgivable sin. If the people believed they could conquer plague through engineering, they would no longer look to the Church for the miracle of survival. The Pope's power to grant salvation was directly proportional to the visible, catastrophic suffering of the populace. Magister Ignace was offering health, and in doing so, he was offering heresy. The red ink entry detailing his removal is cryptic. Transaction for the acquisition of one highly sensitive architectural model, and the transfer of its creator to a permanent, non-communicable sanctuary. The payment was exorbitant enough to fund a small siege. Thomas, in his grief, marked the footnote with the Vesica Piscis inverted 3 times. The scribe knew the truth. The architectural model was the ceramic filter system. The non-communicable sanctuary was a quiet, permanent grave. The Church, in its desire to control the spiritual health of Europe, chose to actively murder its physical health. This single entry is a microcosm of the entire conspiracy. The cold, calculated murder of progress under the guise of bureaucratic necessity. Thomas would often linger over this page, his candle flame casting long shadows on the text. He would imagine the face of the Magister Ignace, full of hope and scientific certainty, and then imagine the moment that hope was crushed by the weight of the Vatican's gold. This quiet contemplation was Thomas's penance, his only form of rebellion. He could not stop the crime, but he could ensure that, in the darkest corners of the archive, the record of the victim's fate remained, legible in its chilling coded geometry. The systematic destruction chronicled by Thomas began to have massive, irreversible consequences far beyond the realm of engineering. The missing mathematical texts, the equations for advanced structural mechanics, led to generations of architects struggling with concepts that should have been trivial. Churches and palaces that should have been magnificent were built smaller, less stable, and more prone to collapse. The grand vision of the Renaissance was constantly compromised by the purposely manufactured ignorance that Thomas recorded with his red ink. The conspiracy of the red ink required absolute, unwavering silence from the highest levels of the Curia. The cardinals who sanctioned these expenditures were not fools. They were deeply intelligent men who had developed a sophisticated, chilling rationale for their actions. This rationale was founded on the poison of pragmatism, the belief that a political power preserved was worth any moral cost. They saw the massive red ink entries not as a sign of sin, but as a sign of successful spiritual warfare. They were paying the price to maintain the balance of the universe as they believed it should be, the spiritual domain belonging solely to the Church, and the material world remaining flawed and dependent, ensuring perpetual demand for the Church's services. To maintain the secrecy, the ledgers themselves were hidden under multiple layers of routine documents. If anyone outside the inner circle questioned the large expenditure on waste disposal, the cardinals would merely point to the general corruption of the age, the need to dispose of heretical tracts, or the simple cost of running a vast bureaucracy. The red ink was their perfect theatrical prop, visible enough to demonstrate control, but coded enough to conceal the true crime. This environment of pervasive, necessary secrecy created a profound moral hypocrisy within the heart of the Church. Imagine a cardinal standing before a congregation, preaching the virtues of charity and the divine light of wisdom, knowing his signature was on the ledger that funded the murder of the wisest men in Europe and diverted wealth away from the very poor he claimed to serve. This cognitive dissonance was the true moral decay of the Soter, the idea that the Church could be the moral savior of the world while simultaneously acting as its greatest technological enemy. It bred a culture of intense paranoia. Thomas, the scribe, was not trusted because of his meticulousness, but despite it. He was monitored constantly, yet because he never spoke, never left the archives, and never complained about the toxic fumes of the red dye, he was deemed a reliable tool. He knew his life depended on his silence. His only comfort was his footnotes, his coded whispers that he believed would, one day, be understood. He poured his agony into the Vatican inverted 3 times, trusting that a future scholar, perhaps centuries later, would find his ledgers and see past the numbers to the tears he had shed over the fate of humanity, the fate of Brother Thomas. Himself is, perhaps, the most poignant entry in the archive. His records suddenly cease 1 year, replaced by the neat, emotionless hand of a new, younger scribe. There is no red ink in the new scribe's entries. Only the official black and the safe green. Thomas did not die in a dramatic confrontation. He was simply retired. The official record states he was granted a quiet, comfortable annuity and transferred to a small, remote monastery in the Apennine Mountains. A handsome payment marked naturally in the final red ink entry for lifelong retirement and spiritual study. The truth, however, is that Thomas had become a liability. He knew too much. The annuity was not a reward, but a final payment for silence. He spent the remainder of his days in that remote cell, surrounded by mountains, watching the slow, inefficient lives of the local peasantry, the very poverty he knew he had the documentation to end. He held the knowledge of the Industrial Revolution in his mind, and yet he was forbidden to whisper a single equation. Imagine Thomas in that cell. He would look at the ink stains on his fingers, the faint crimson of the toxic red dye that never quite washed away. He had failed. His coded protest remained locked in the archive, unseen by the world, drowned out by the thunder of the Church's financial prosperity. The tears he shed over his ledgers, over the ashes of the Archimedes Code, had become invisible. Yet his legacy endured. Years after his death, the new scribe, the one who wrote only in safe, dull colors, was commissioned to review the massive expenditures of the purification rites. He found the red ink strange, confusing, and noted the curious symbols in the margin. He could not decode the Vesica or the sulfur, but his curiosity was piqued. He began to search for other documents that might explain the symbols. His search was initially slow, confined to the outer rings of the Vatican bureaucracy. But his persistence, born of simple, bureaucratic curiosity, led him to a collection of highly sealed, non-standard letters between a specific cardinal and a scholar in northern Italy. This cardinal, who frequently signed off on Thomas's red ink entries, was asking the scholar to analyze ancient Roman engineering methods. Why? Why would a cardinal who spent a fortune destroying knowledge suddenly commission a meticulous study of the very thing he was burning? The new scribe began to understand that the cover-up was not just about destroying the technology. It was also about controlling it. The Church had not annihilated the knowledge entirely. They had preserved a small, terrifying library of functional blueprints for their own private, political, and personal use. They wanted to maintain the lie of ignorance for the populace, while secretly exploiting the very progress they denied to the world. The red ink, therefore, was not just the cost of suppression. It was the cost of selective preservation, the true tragedy of the scribe's tears and the red ink is not that the secret was kept, but that the man who chronicled the crime was punished more severely than the criminals. He was sentenced to a life of quiet, enforced wisdom, forced to live every day with the knowledge that he held the solutions to the world's suffering, yet could not act. He became a living monument to the profound moral decay of the Renaissance papacy. His tears, captured in the toxic crimson dye, whisper one final, haunting question through the centuries. If you had the power to save the world, but your salvation required your silence, would you weep the truth onto a secret page or scream it into the fire? This search for the hidden, preserved knowledge leads us to the next chamber, to the figure who might have held the key to both the burning and the preservation, a forgotten academic figure silenced and banished for understanding the truth too clearly. The most powerful secret is not the one that is burned, but the one that is briefly seen. The great betrayal of the Renaissance popes, suppression of technology, was nearly exposed by a single shattering event. For a few short hours in 1499, a forbidden truth materialized within the Vatican walls, the impossible device. It was a machine of bronze and crystal, a hydrostatic marvel capable of feats no Renaissance engineer should have conceived. It was a tangible, silent scream against the lie of the Church's limited knowledge. This device, hidden and preserved by the very cardinals who funded the great burnings, proved their moral decay was absolute. They did not destroy the blueprints because they were dangerous. They destroyed them so they alone could possess the forbidden's power. The public saw a miracle. The Church saw a curse upon their control. And then it vanished entirely, leaving only a few terrified witnesses and a centuries-long cover-up. This is the truth the Church buried, hiding the power they could not afford to share. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the quiet solitude of the scribe's counting room to the shimmering, deceptive chaos of a papal celebration. Imagine the noise, the silk, the opulence, but look closer through the crowd towards a quiet, heavily guarded alcove. We seek the fleeting, terrifying moment when the curtain was pulled back, just enough to reveal a sliver of the future that was stolen. We seek the glimpse of the impossible device. The year is 1499, the great Basilica of St. Peter, or perhaps an earlier version of the Apostolic Palace, is adorned for a feast of profound spiritual and political significance. There is music. There is feasting, and the air is thick with the sweet perfume of power. The Renaissance popes, masters of spectacle, understood that political control was often best exercised through awe and theatrical wonder. This was the perfect setting for a calculated deception. The device itself was a marvel of ancient engineering, likely reconstructed from the most complete, functional blueprints that the Church had chosen to preserve rather than burn. It was a machine, perhaps, of hydrostatic memory, self-regulating clockwork model demonstrating complex planetary motion and an impossibly efficient flow of water, all powered by a single self-contained mechanism. Contemporary accounts, fragmented and unreliable, speak of something made of shining bronze, with crystals that moved without a hand and water that ran uphill and never ceased. It was a spectacle intended to convince visiting dignitaries, princes, foreign ambassadors, and skeptical scholars that the Church's power was not just spiritual, but possessed of a divine understanding of mechanics far beyond the grasp of secular man. The machine was positioned in a central yet restricted area, Ropes of heavy velvet kept the common crowd at bay. The cardinals, in their silk and wool, stood near it, gesturing vaguely toward the heavens, attributing the machine's impossible motion to a miracle of God's own mechanical genius. But the real purpose of the display was subtle, yet terrifying. It was a demonstration of intellectual scarcity. The popes were saying, yes, such power exists, but it is ours alone. It is a gift from God only we can mediate and understand. Do not look for it in books. Look for it in us. The great majority of witnesses were overwhelmed. They believed it was a miracle, a genuine sign of divine favor for the papal state. It served its purpose, perfectly reinforcing the Church's narrative that while man's ingenuity was limited and prone to error, the Church's knowledge was boundless. However, a handful of people in the crowd possessed the analytical minds to see past the spectacle and recognize the pure, functional engineering at its core. These were the former patrons of the engineers who had been silenced, the mathematicians who had studied Greek texts, and the few honest craftsmen who knew the true limits of Renaissance metallurgy. They recognized the device not as a miracle, but as a working solution to problems that were still plaguing Europe. They saw in a single terrifying glimpse the centuries of technological progress that the Church had just claimed for its own private, divine account. One such witness was a master clockmaker from Augsburg named Heinrich. He had traveled to Rome hoping to secure papal patronage for a complex astronomical clock he had designed. Heinrich stood near the velvet rope, his eyes fixed not on the crystal spheres, but on the bearings and the incredibly fine, consistent gearing of the impossible device. Heinrich knew the mechanical limits of his age. He knew the tolerances, the friction, and the alloys that were available. What he saw was impossible. The machine was operating with an efficiency that defied friction. It was using principles of hydraulics and counterbalance that belonged to a history he had never read. He didn't see a miracle. He saw 100 years of lost refinement condensed into a single object. He whispered the truth, perhaps to his apprentice, a simple phrase that sealed his fate. That cannot be a miracle. That is simply mathematics we have forgotten. In a place where miracles are currency, such a statement is not skepticism, it is high treason. Within hours, Heinrich found himself detained. His crime was not heresy, but intellectual recognition. The Church did not fear that he would steal the device, but that he would decode the principles behind it and expose the engineered nature of the miracle. His workshop in Augsburg was quietly searched by agents posing as papal auditors. His detailed notes, his experimental diagrams, and his correspondence with other free-thinking engineers were all seized. His clock, the one he had spent 10 years perfecting, was declared too close to the devil's work and subsequently melted down, its precision gears recast as decorative candlesticks for a minor chapel. Heinrich himself was convinced to retire to a remote Italian monastery, where he was strictly forbidden from ever handling tools or calculating anything beyond the weekly food stores. The disappearance of Heinrich and the abrupt end of his successful workshop became a subtle, unstated warning across Europe's nascent scientific community. The message was clear: the practical knowledge of the world is a monopoly of the Holy See. But what of the device itself? The official account claims it was dismantled, and the parts were distributed as relics to various churches, the miracle dissolving into the memory of the faithful. This was another calculated lie. The impossible device was not destroyed. It was immediately and expertly packaged and moved to its permanent vault. This chamber, known only by the chilling code named the Repository of Unspoken Truths, was not Beneath the Vatican library, but deep within the private summer residence of the Pope, a villa far removed from the public eye. Here, surrounded by manicured gardens and quiet vineyards, the church maintained its own secret laboratory. They didn't just preserve the forbidden texts. They actively studied them, maintaining the technology they denied to the world. The repository of unspoken truths was an exquisite, terrible contradiction. It was a perfectly organized workshop containing the finest tools, the cleanest alloys, and the most advanced schematics, everything the rest of Europe was denied. This was the dark heart of the conspiracy the church was actively harvesting. The fruits of the technology it had banned, ensuring its own elite enjoyed the benefits of a future they had stolen from humanity. Why maintain the impossible device? It served three crucial secret functions. First, strategic defense. The popes needed to know the actual military and engineering limits of their potential enemies. By maintaining and mastering the ancient technology, they could instantly recognize if a secular power came close to developing a truly revolutionary, church-threatening invention. The repository was an intellectual radar, monitoring the technological horizon. Second, elite health and comfort. The impossible device was often used as a prototype for systems that immediately benefited the curia, the ceramic filters that Magister Ignis had perfected were not destroyed. They were replicated in secret and installed in the private water supplies of the most powerful cardinals and the papal apartments, ensuring their personal protection from the plagues that ravaged the Roman slums. The papacy preached spiritual healing while securing their own physical health through forbiddance. Secular science. Third, and perhaps most chillingly, the psychological test. The device was occasionally shown to certain trusted, brilliant young theologians and scholars. They were allowed to study it, to understand its non-miraculous, purely mathematical nature. This was the final, devastating initiation into the conspiracy. By forcing these scholars to choose between the pure, logical truth of the machine and the official political lie of the miracle, the church secured their absolute moral obedience. Once a man chose the lie over the visible truth, his soul was effectively bound to the conspiracy forever. Imagine one such scholar, Father Marco, staring at the self-regulating water pump, understanding the principles of fluid dynamics that could save thousands of lives. He realizes the whole system, the plagues, the poverty, the ignorances engineered and maintained by the men who command his obedience. That realization is the final, profound act of moral decay. Father Marco was forced to confront the theological weight of repeatable science in its most physical form. Science, reproducible and verifiable, requires no faith in the mediator. It is a direct relationship between man and nature. The Church understood that this direct relationship was its greatest existential threat. It was a quiet, constant declaration of man's independence. The glimpse of the impossible device left a few lasting, faint scars on the historical record, visible only to those looking for a contradiction. These scars are not found in ledgers, but in the most mundane, overlooked Vatican documents, the inventory of papal assets. Look closely at the records detailing the Pope's personal jewelry and vessels. During the period immediately following the public display of the device, there is a strange entry, a significant, repeated order for a specific, highly durable, non-tarnishing alloy, a metal far superior to any publicly available in Renaissance Italy. The reason given is for the restoration of ancient holy relics. The truth? This specialized metal was being used to maintain and repair the impossible device and the other forbidden prototypes in the repository. The church was essentially running a covert metallurgy lab to keep the ghost of the Industrial Revolution perfectly preserved and operational, all while pretending it was spending the money on polishing a statue of St. Peter. Another piece of evidence lies in the bizarre architectural requests made by a cardinal involved in the cover-up. He commissioned a private chapel unremarkable except for its perfect, constant temperature and humidity. The explanation was divine climate control. The reality was that he had adapted the complex, closed-loop ventilation and thermal regulation technology found in the impossible device's blueprints, ensuring his personal comfort and health was secured by the very science he helped banish. This is the definition of moral hypocrisy made manifest. The crime is not just the act of burning, but the decision to then live by the rules of the superior, forbids knowledge while condemning the rest of humanity to the struggles of ignorance. The cover-up worked because the lie was so magnificent. The cardinals successfully implanted the idea that the greatest human achievements belonged to the past, to the forgotten Romans, and that contemporary man was too flawed, too sinful to replicate them. They nurtured the concept of a golden age that was perpetually out of reach, ensuring that no one would dare challenge the church by claiming the power of the forbidden past could be grasped in the present. The impossible device was the single, fleeting object that proved this lie was baseless. It proved that the ability was still there, preserved in the archives they were burning. It was the ultimate contradiction, a tangible piece of the future that the papacy was actively fighting against. And for this reason, its physical existence became the Church's greatest, most guarded secret. The glimpse of the impossible device changed the Vatican forever. It solidified the Curia's belief that their power was perpetually under threat from the sheer capability of man's intellect. The cover-up became not just a policy but a theological, imperative and necessary defense against what they saw as the corrosive nature of material truth. The few who witnessed the machine and failed to see a miracle, those who saw only mathematics, were either silenced, like Heinrich the clockmaker. To cloak this ideological suppression and legitimacy, the Church did not issue a simple ban on engineering. Instead, they subtly elevated doctrines that explicitly demonized certainty and predictability in the material world. The philosophical movement that supported the Church's position argued for the divine necessity of chaos. One decree, issued by a Renaissance pope shortly after the first great purge of texts, focused on the dangers of presumptive reason. This decree stated that any human endeavor that sought to achieve results with absolute and unwavering certainty, eliminating the role of divine chance, was an act of profound spiritual arrogance. It framed the scientific method itself as a challenge to God's omnipotence. The implication was chilling. A scientist who guaranteed a result was inherently more dangerous than a sinner who relied on prayer. The sinner preserved the theological hierarchy. The scientist destroyed it. Furthermore, the Church began to invest heavily in the theatrics of the miraculous. Every successful harvest that followed a drought, every remission of a disease, every victory in war was amplified 1,000 times. The miracle was made deliberately loud and deliberately public to drown out the quiet, consistent hum of repeatable science. The impossible device, which we explored previously, was the perfect tool for this, a technical marvel presented as a divine mystery. This environment led to a strange, dark irony. The official Church had to rely on a certain amount of natural suffering to maintain its power. Famine and plague were not viewed as tragedies to be solved, but as theological opportunities, moments when the populace was most humble, most fearful, and most in need of the church's mediation. The engineers, the mathematicians, and the healers who possessed the forbidden knowledge were targeted precisely because they threatened to remove these opportunities. They were the true heretics of the Renaissance, not for disagreeing with Scripture, but for offering solutions that work too well. Imagine the profound isolation of a cardinal who understood this theological trap. He might personally believe in the elegant perfection of the hydraulic pump. He might privately use the forbidden knowledge to ensure his own survival during a plague. Yet he would be forced to participate in the political machine that ensured the vast majority of his flock remained fearful, unhealthy, and dependent on the miraculous. This contradiction was the daily, agonizing theological weight of repeatable science. The destruction of the forbidden texts was not carried out by illiterate thugs. It was a precise, meticulous ceremony, the ritual of the sacred flame. The church was so afraid of the intellectual contagion that they treated the texts not merely as dangerous documents, but as objects imbued with a demonic, anti-spiritual power. Picture the scene: the designated chamber, lined with obsidian or dark stone to absorb any residual profane knowledge. The scribe, like Brother Thomas, would first categorize the texts, identifying which ones contained the most functional, repeatable knowledge. The engineering treatises, the mathematical schematics, and the early medical texts were placed on a separate altar before the fire was lit. A special blessing was performed, not to thank God, but to ask for forgiveness for the act of reading. The texts were not burned whole. They were carefully cut, their pages ripped, and sometimes soaked in specific essential oils that were thought to have purifying, exorcising properties. The goal was to ensure not just the physical destruction of the page, but the spiritual destruction of the idea. By tearing the page, they symbolized the tearing of the concept from the fabric of reality. By mixing the text with oils, they performed a perverse sacrament, the purification of the paper. Before its annihilation, this ritual reveals the full extent of the Church's theological terror. They did not trust God to simply render the knowledge inert. They felt they had to actively intervene, using ritual magic and meticulous violence, to ensure that the scientific principle, the pure, repeatable truth, could never re-enter the minds of men. They saw the equation, the formula, the schematic, as a living, breathing heresy. This fear was further amplified by the fate of the authors. The names of the forbidden Roman and Byzantine engineers were meticulously scrubbed from the historical record, replaced by generic, dismissive labels like pagan, heretic, or philosopher of illusions. The greatest technological minds in history were erased by decree, their achievements attributed to either myth or later to the sudden, inexplicable genius of Renaissance scholars who conveniently rediscovered the concepts. Centuries too late, the core theological rejection was of the clockwork God, the idea, hinted at in the forgotten Greek philosophy, that God created the universe and then set it in motion according to fixed, perfect laws. If this were true, then man's duty would be to study those laws, not to beg for divine intervention. The forbidden texts prove the clockwork God's existence. The Church demanded belief in the interventionist God, who required priests and rituals to affect the world. This fundamental ideological chasm between a universe of laws and a universe of miracles was the true fire that fueled the Vatican's campaign of suppression, maintaining The lie of the interventionist God and rejecting the theological weight of repeatable science required an immense, sustained campaign of political and social control. It was not enough to burn the books. They had to ensure the population believed in chaos. The church began to invest heavily in the public spectacle of unpredictability. Festivals were organized around sudden, inexplicable blessings. Religious orders were funded specifically to report on miraculous cures and unexpected reversals of fortune. The entire social fabric was designed to reinforce the idea that the world was fundamentally unstable, requiring constant spiritual guidance. Furthermore, any practical innovation that did manage to slip through the net, a slightly better plow, a more efficient mill, was instantly co-opted. The inventor was forced to publicly dedicate his creation to a saint, attributing the success not to his mathematics, but to divine inspiration. This was the official, institutionalized method of neutralizing repeatable science. Strip the scientist of credit and give the credit to God, and, by extension, the Church. The great scientists who dared to calculate certainties were therefore targeted with extreme prejudice. When an Italian scholar used mathematics to predict the exact path of a comet, proving celestial motion was predictable, he was not burned for heresy, but for undermining the divine chaos. His work was confiscated, and he was forced to spend his remaining years writing complex, meaningless horoscopes. His true genius converted into a political tool for distraction. The cardinals, in their quiet debates, understood the immense political risk of their actions. They knew they were prolonging human suffering, but they viewed it as a necessary evil, a temporary, physical suffering exchanged for the long-term spiritual stability of the world secured under their command. This internal contradiction, the pursuit of spiritual good through material evil, is the highest form of moral decay, the memory of the impossible device, which we explored in the previous chapter, served as a constant reminder of the power they possessed and the power they chose to deny. They knew that if the common man saw that machine, the ideological scaffolding holding up the church's authority would crumble instantly. The crime was complete when the cardinals began to believe their own lie. After decades of burning, of forced sermons, and of institutionalized suppression, the distinction between the necessary political lie and the theological truth blurred. They genuinely began to believe that the scientific certainty was, in fact, an actual demonic threat to the divine order. The political suppression had transformed into a self-perpetuating theological reality. The silence of the intellectual elite became the loudest form of historical record. The philosophers, poets, and early scientists who understood the forbidden concepts were forced into a profound state of cognitive exile, living in a world where they knew the truth, but could only speak in metaphors and coded allegories, forever pretending that 2 + 2 sometimes equals 5, just to survive. The theological weight of repeatable science was the heaviest burden the Renaissance Church ever chose to carry. It was the decision that defined centuries of European history, a deliberate choice to sacrifice the physical reality of the present for the political permanence of the institution. As we look back at the ritualistic burnings and the intense doctrinal debates, the final consequence of this profound moral decay becomes clear. The Church created a world where ignorance was piety and knowledge was sin. This warped reality ensured that when the next wave of scientific innovation finally did emerge centuries later, during the true age of enlightenment, it would do so in direct, violent opposition to the Church, cementing a philosophical divide that lasts to this day. The Church was not accidentally opposed to science. It was systemically, existentially, and theologically opposed to the idea of certainty itself. The scholars who were banished, the men who understood the certainty of the forbidden knowledge, became the final guardians of the truth. They were forced to disperse, taking the remnants of the ancient texts with them, hiding the schematics within the patterns of embroidery, the ratios within musical compositions, and the formulas within coded letters to distant patrons. The most tragic of these banished figures was the scholar who had been closest to the Pope, the one who tried to argue against the theological necessity of chaos, pleading for the human right to understand and solve the world. He was silenced, removed from the heart of Rome, and sent to the most remote northern edge of the civilized world. He took with him a small sealed box, the only part of the Forbidden's library he was permitted to keep. That box, and the quiet existence of the man who guards it, is the final key to understanding the scope of the Church's terror. He is a living archive, a constant reminder that the Forbidden's knowledge survived the fire. But only by being sentenced to exile, his story leads us to the quiet forests and the frozen lakes of northern Europe, where the truth was forced to sleep. We must now follow the man who was erased from history. The scholar who was retreated to the north, the great crime of the Renaissance. Papacy was not a haphazard act of censorship, but a systematic ceremonial betrayal of human intellect. The popes masked their technological suppression behind the ritual of the sacred flame. This was not an ordinary bonfire. It was a devastating sacrament of ignorance, framed as an act of purification. The Church spent a fortune on priests, oils, and specialized censors to turn the burning of advanced blueprints into a religious necessity, making the destruction of knowledge itself a holy act. This elaborate ceremony was the ultimate lie, designed to cover up the moral decay of cardinals who knew the value of the forbidden texts, yet chose to consume them in fire, damning the world to darkness for the sake of their political power. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the debates of doctrine into the physical space of the execution. Imagine a sealed chamber within the deepest subvaults of the apostolic palace. The air is dry and cold, but for one corner where the furnace rests, there is a terrible, hungry heat. Here, in the quiet solitude, the Church performed its greatest act of calculated destruction, transforming the crime of arson into the ritual of the sacred flame. The chamber was meticulously prepared. It was lined not with marble, but with rough, absorbing stone, believed to prevent the dangerous, heretical knowledge from leaching back into the Vatican's foundations. The furnace itself was a bespoke piece of ironwork, a special construction. Commissioned by the Curia, it was designed for slow, total consumption, not rapid incineration. Ensuring that no useful fragment of metal or legible scrap of parchment could survive, the ritual began at midnight. It was attended only by the highest-ranking cardinals responsible for the Officium Securitas Scripturae, and a handful of specialized silent priests sworn to perpetual secrecy. The atmosphere was one of profound, perverse devotion. This was not viewed as an administrative task, but as a spiritual necessity, a divine intervention against the contamination of man's mind. The texts themselves, having been categorized and logged with Brother Thomas's mournful red ink, were brought in on heavy, carved wooden trolleys. These were not pamphlets or philosophical tracts. Many were large, bound volumes of Byzantine mathematics, Roman engineering treatises, and meticulously copied Arabic medical texts. Each volume, heavy with the weight of centuries of knowledge, was treated with a terrifying, meticulous respect before being placed in the furnace. Each text underwent the rite of separation. The cardinal celebrant, wearing specific dark vestments, would use a silver knife not to tear the page, but to slice precisely through the diagrams and equations, ensuring the functional unity of the concept was destroyed. They were not destroying paper. They were destroying the relationship between the numbers. Imagine the cardinal's hand, steady and precise, slicing through the schematic for the impossible device, severing the connection between the cogs and the water supply. The act was a declaration. We break the chain of cause and effect. The fire was prepared using specific, blessed woods and saturated with exorcised oils, expensive, fragrant compounds that were usually reserved for anointing new altars or purifying objects believed to be touched by demonic forces. Here, these oils were deployed against the ideas themselves. One of the primary compounds was derived from a rare, toxic strain of frankincense, chosen because its smoke was believed to cloud rational thought and induce a state of heightened emotional reverence. As the smoke from the sacred flame filled the chamber, the cardinals themselves were psychologically manipulated by the rite they performed. The smoke helped them transition from the cold, calculated logic of suppression to the fervent, self-justifying mindset of the crusader. They were convincing themselves, through the scent and the sensory deprivation, that the pages they were destroying were not filled with engineering genius, but with the literal script of the devil, a forbidden language of mathematics meant to lure humanity away from God. The burning itself was a study in symbolic violence. The priests would chant a specific repetitive prayer, a litany that replaced the scientific terminology of the text with abstract spiritual concepts. When an equation for celestial mechanics was consumed, the priest would chant, "May the heavens remain a mystery." When a formula for metallurgy was destroyed, the response was, "May man remain dependent on the bounty of the earth." The ritual of the sacred flame was thus a counter-language, a theological weapon used to annihilate scientific language. It was designed to replace the certainty of the formula with the necessity of the miracle. Imagine the sheer physical labor of the purge. The process was slow, extending over weeks, sometimes months, as volumes were brought forward one by one. The priests and workers became exhausted, their hands blackened by the ash, their minds dulled by the smoke. They were the physical embodiment of the church's exhaustion, the burden of maintaining a world of darkness. This intense, prolonged ceremonial burning explains the enormous costs recorded in Brother Thomas's red ink ledgers. The money was not just for wood and oil, it was for the silence of the priests, the specialized construction of the furnace, the transport of the vast, heavy volumes, and the cost of the toxic, mind-altering oils. The church was willing to spend its political fortune to secure the spiritual lie. The greatest fear was not that the material would survive, but that the memory would persist. Therefore, the ash from the furnace was collected with obsessive care. It was not simply thrown away. It was meticulously mixed with consecrated soil and scattered in specific, obscure locations known only to the highest cardinal. Ensuring the total annihilation of the intellectual residue, let us focus on one terrible night during the ritual of the sacred flame. The volume being destroyed was not a complex machine blueprint, but a collection of medical observations and anatomical drawings from a brilliant, forgotten Greek physician. This text contained knowledge of basic germ theory and surgical sanitation simple, repeatable steps that could have drastically reduced mortality from childbirth. Fever and minor injuries. As the cardinal prepared to slice the pages, he paused. He was a man of his time, but he was also a man who had watched his own sister die from a common infection after giving birth. He knew the potential of the knowledge he was about to erase. He was forced to confront the terrible truth that the knowledge in his hands could save lives. Consistently, without prayer, the internal struggle must have been agonizing. His theological training, the theological weight of repeatable science demanded the destruction of the book to protect the spiritual economy of the church. But his human conscience screamed at the sheer, brutal waste of life that this act would cause. He overcame the momentary lapse in resolve. By focusing on the mantra, material truth is the enemy of eternal salvation, he completed the rite of separation, slicing through the anatomical drawings and the simple instructions for washing surgical tools. As the volume was consigned to the flames, the smoke, thick with the fragrant, mind-dulling oils, enveloped him, extinguishing the last flicker of his conscience. The loss of that single volume, documented in the red ink ledger under the cryptic code, Medicus Prohibitus, condemned Europe to centuries of preventable medical misery. Every future death from a simple wound, every mother lost to fever, became a silent sacrifice to the ritual of the sacred flame. The public-facing aspects of the Church's power were also deeply entwined with the ritual. Whenever a foreign dignitary or a powerful secular rival questioned the massive, unexplained expenditures in the PayPal accounts, the cardinals would invite them to a carefully choreographed, highly controlled glimpse of the ritual. They would witness the furnace, smell the sacred oils, and see the cardinals performing their fervent prayers against the demonic knowledge. The message was clear: the Church was acting as the world's spiritual police, protecting Christendom from dangerous, chaotic philosophy. The visitor would leave impressed by the Church's devotion, never realizing they had just witnessed the destruction of the very technology that could make their own kingdoms wealthier and healthier. The ritual of the sacred flame, therefore, was a double cover-up. It masked the moral betrayal from the clergy, and it masked the technological suppression from the political rivals. It was the perfect, terrifying theatrical solution to the ultimate crime. The cardinals believed the ritual was total and effective, but the very act of destruction left psychological scars that they could not burn away. The smell of the exorcised oils, the very scent of the ritual, became a haunting trigger for the participants. In the years following the massive purges, the highest-ranking Curia members found themselves unable to tolerate certain incense or strong perfumes. The scent was too close to the memory of the furnace, too close to the moral crime they had committed. The smoke from the sacred flame also carried the memory of the forbidden ideas. Although the priests chanted to replace the knowledge with spiritual abstraction, the sight of the burning texts indelibly etched the general idea of the lost technology into their minds. They knew that something profound was destroyed. Even if they forgot the formula, they remembered the potential. This knowledge, this terrible awareness of a stolen future, created a lasting, profound paranoia within the Vatican. They knew that they were now the sole possessors of this terrible truth, and they lived in constant fear that the technology they destroyed would be reinvented by a secular genius outside their control. This fear led to the next inevitable stage of the cover-up, the active monitoring and silencing of any emerging technological talent across Europe. A policy formalized by the secretive Officium Securitas Scripturae. The burning was a one-time purge. The monitoring was a permanent, necessary state of war against human intellect, the most concrete evidence that the ritual of the sacred flame failed to destroy the idea lies in the remnants discovered by archival researchers centuries later. In the Vatican subvaults among the rubble and ash were small, fused artifacts, the lumps of metallic alloys and parchment we discussed earlier. These lumps, which are the ashes of the Archimedes Code, are the physical proof that the ritual was incomplete. The intense heat of the furnace, instead of utterly annihilating the materials, sometimes fused them into ultra-dense, non-biodegradable forms. The heat, intended to destroy the knowledge, instead preserved a fragment of the proof, locking the scientific principle into a silent, anachronistic monument. The irony is devastating. The Church commissioned a ritual of fire to wipe the slate clean. But the fire itself created the indisputable physical evidence of the crime. The cardinals believed they were securing 1,000 years of darkness, but they were actually forging the historical bullet that would eventually pierce the heart of their own lie. The moral decay of the soda reached its absolute low point in this chamber of ashes. They were not merely suppressing a revolution. They were murdering hope in a ceremonial, self-righteous act, all while the scent of purifying smoke choked the remnants of their own conscience. The legacy of the ritual of the sacred flame is the lingering absence of a brighter past. The smoke has cleared, the ash has been scattered, but the cost of centuries of preventable suffering and stagnation remains a permanent, invisible scar on the timeline of Europe. We understand now that the destruction was necessary for the Church's political survival, but we also recognize the profound, chilling arrogance of the act, the belief that a handful of men had the right to decide that humanity was unworthy of its own genius. The fire was meant to be the end of the story, but the idea survived. It survived in the coded footnotes of Brother Thomas. It survived in the silent memory of the cardinals. And most importantly, it survived in the hands of the banished scholars who had fled Rome, carrying fragments of the forbidden's knowledge with them. Determined to keep the truth alive even in exile, the Vatican succeeded in burning the physical books. But they failed to burn the truth of repeatable science. They merely forced it into hiding, scattering it across the fringes of the world. The scholar, who carried the final, terrible piece of the functional code, was sent far from the warmth of the Mediterranean fire. He traveled north into the cold, quiet realms, carrying a small, sealed box, the only part of the Forbidden's library he was permitted to keep. He became the solitary guardian of the suppressed truth, a man whose scientific genius was forced to masquerade as rustic piety. His story is the key to understanding the final stage of the conspiracy. How the Church's paranoia hunted the remnants of knowledge, even in the remote corners of the world. We must now follow the man who was erased from history, the scholar who was retreated to the north. The most profound secret buried by the Renaissance papacy was not about gold or power, but about the very nature of existence itself. The source of their terror was the fear of the clockwork god. The Forbidden's ancient texts contained a shattering betrayal. The universe was not a realm of divine chaos requiring miracles and constant priestly mediation, but an elegant, predictable machine set in motion by fixed, knowable laws. This simple, mechanical truth that the cosmos was a clockwork was a direct curse upon the Church's authority. It rendered the spiritual mediator obsolete. This psychological and theological dread drove the cardinals to commit their great crime, the systemic burning of blueprints, an act of moral decay intended to ensure that humanity would forever believe in the unpredictable, interventionist deity whose power they alone could access. This is the truth the Church buried. Fighting against mathematics to preserve the miracle. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the spectacle of the ritual fire into the cold, deep recesses of the Renaissance mind. Imagine the most brilliant theologians and scientists of the age, cloistered in a dimly lit room, agonizing over a single, devastating philosophical dilemma. The entire conspiracy of suppression was born from this terrible question: what if God designed the universe to be perfectly predictable? This is the heart of the fear of the clockwork God. The Church, in its long history, had faced many threats, rival empires, political schisms, and theological heresies. But the concept of the clockwork God, the central doctrine hinted at in the forbidden texts, was a different kind of monster entirely. A clockwork is a device of exquisite deterministic precision. Every gear, every spring, every lever moves according to a fixed, unchangeable law. If the universe was a divine clock wound by the Creator on the first day, then its operation followed mathematical necessity, not spiritual whim. This concept undermined the Church's power on three foundational levels. Firstly, it destroyed the necessity of prayer for material outcomes. Why beg for rain when a hydraulic engineer, using the mechanical laws of the clockwork, could predict and manage the water flow? Secondly, it challenged the concept of original sin as the primary source of human suffering. If suffering from famine, plague, or cold could be solved by following a mathematical formula, then it was a flaw in human understanding, not a punishment from a capricious God. Most fatally, it rendered the priest as mediator obsolete. If the laws of the universe were accessible through rational thought and calculation, then every scholar, every self-taught craftsman, every man with a steady mind could access the divine truth directly, without the need for a hierarchical, sacramental church structure. The theological weight of repeatable science became literally the weight of the clock that threatened to crush the Church's political edifice. The cardinals who studied the Forbidden's blueprints understood this perfectly. They saw that the problem was not sin, the problem was solution. The very presence of a guaranteed cure for plague or a predictable method for printing books was an active, constant declaration of the clockwork God's mechanical, unforgiving logic. And that logic left no room for the intervening priest. The Church's response to the fear of the clockwork God was not sudden. It was rooted in centuries of institutional resistance to deterministic thought. They had long battled philosophical schools that proposed a perfectly ordered universe. But the Renaissance texts were different. They offered not just philosophy, but functional, repeatable proof. The cardinals therefore had to construct a powerful theological defense mechanism. They amplified the doctrine of divine will and omnipotence, arguing that God's power must, by definition, include the ability to violate his own laws at any moment. This doctrine was crucial. It turned the predictable nature of the clockwork God into a dangerous illusion. They preached that relying solely on human reason was an act of profound spiritual naivete. The machine might work 10 times, but on the 11th time, God, in his infinite and terrifying power, might intervene to stop the gears, shattering the clock and the hubris of the engineer. This reinforced the idea that uncertainty was a necessary condition of faith. Uncertainty was a sign of the devil's tempting illusion. To support this new theological mandate, the Church began to aggressively promote the concept of the miracle as political tool. Every flood, every drought, Every inexplicable recovery was not a random event, but a public demonstration of the interventionist. God's power, a power that required the Church as the necessary intermediary to soothe or manage, imagine the Pope, receiving detailed weather reports compiled by the handful of forbiddance, co-opted scientific minds in the Vatican. He knows a drought is coming, but instead of using the forbiddance irrigation schematics to prepare, he organizes a highly publicized penitential procession praying for rain. The irrigation system, if deployed, would prove the predictability of nature. The procession, if followed by even a small rainfall, proves the necessity of the priest. The choice was always clear: sacrifice, the science for the spectacle. This internal contradiction created a culture of institutional hypocrisy that stretched from the papal chambers to the remote parish. Every priest was, intentionally or unintentionally, an agent of the lie, preaching the unpredictable chaos of the universe while depending on the hidden order maintained by the curious secret, intelligence. And what was the psychological cost on the populace? They were forced to live in a state of perpetual, manufactured anxiety, a world where their physical health and material well-being were constantly at risk. Yet the solutions were forbidden. Their only avenue for safety was constant, fearful supplication. This ensured their obedience, but at the cost of genuine intellectual freedom. The deep-seated fear of the clockwork God manifested physically in the very design and decoration of the Vatican. While Michelangelo was busy painting the glory of the Creator giving life to Adam, the Church was ensuring that every physical structure around them symbolized the triumph of chaos over order. Don't look closely at the elaborate clock towers commissioned during this era. They were often intentionally designed to be imprecise, grand, ornate, but mechanically flawed. This was done to reinforce the theological mandate. The Church could not ban clocks entirely, but they could ensure that the public experience of time and measurement was marked by unreliability, ensuring that only the Church's internal, hidden astronomical calculations, based on the forbidden's ancient texts, were accurate. The flawed public clock became a visual metaphor for the chaos of the material world. Furthermore, the ornamentation of the new basilicas often depicted mechanical devices being broken, seized, or swallowed by demonic entities. These were not casual artistic flourishes. They were direct propaganda, visualizing the fate of the forbidden's knowledge. The image was clear. To engage in purely deterministic science was to hand one's soul over to forces that would ultimately break the mechanism. Even the rituals used to bless new machinery or scientific instruments were subtly altered. The prayers emphasized the fragility of human endeavor and the imminent risk of failure, subtly priming the public to expect that any success was temporary and could be revoked by divine fiat, that the ultimate goal was mental disarmament. If a peasant believed that his own well-engineered wooden wheel was likely to break, but the holy relic housed in the nearby church was eternally stable, the Church had successfully reversed the actual reality of the situation. The physical world, which was inherently predictable, was presented as chaotic. The spiritual world, which was inherently mysterious, was presented as orderly and certain. The constant repetition of this reversal, this deliberate, systemic confusion, was the true psychological tool of the cover-up. It was the only way to defend against the simple, elegant logic of the clockwork God. This pervasive fear also drove the desperation of the Officium Securitas Scripturae. They were not just searching for books to burn. They were hunting for the physical proof of the lie. They understood that one functioning hydraulic pump, one reliable printing press, or one accurate clock, if publicly deployed, could undo decades of careful propaganda. Their urgency was born of the terror that the clockwork god's laws might be demonstrated publicly before they could be suppressed. The scholars who understood the clockwork god's principles were the most dangerous threats, precisely because their moral compass was often superior to the church's. They were not driven by greed, but by the pure, calm desire for truth and utility. They were banished not for sin, but for unwavering intellectual integrity. The Vatican developed a secret, psychological profile for these thinkers. They were typically quiet, averse to spectacle, obsessed with precision, and motivated by solving human problems rather than seeking personal glory. This profile became the hunting guide for the agents of the Officium. Securitas Scripturae. The chief architect of the banishment policy was a man named Cardinal Vespucci, who recognized that these scholars could never be bought or converted. They had seen the pure, beautiful logic of the universe, and once that had been glimpsed, it was impossible to unsee. Therefore, the only solution was quarantine. The famous case of the scholar who was retreated to the north exemplifies this policy. This man understood the mathematical laws of the clockwork better than anyone in Rome. He pleaded with the cardinals, not for his own life, but for the right to use the knowledge to end the suffering of the poor. His integrity was his undoing. Cardinal Vespucci saw the scholar's moral conviction as proof of his danger. A man who valued functional truth over political obedience was a virus that could infect the entire body of Christ. The sentence of banishment was cruel and calculated. Send the scholar to the farthest reaches of the known world, forcing him into physical isolation and spiritual silence, ensuring that the elegant, dangerous truths in his mind would have no audience. The single sealed box the scholar was permitted to carry was a final, perverse psychological torment. The church knew it contained a fragment of the forbidden texts, but they let him keep it. They understood that the greater punishment was not the loss of the book, but the enforced inability to share its truth. They sentenced him to a life of living proof of the cure, while watching the world suffer the disease, the system, where truth was treated as a curse and intellectual honesty as a crime was the final, complete expression of the fear of the clockwork god. It ensured that the Renaissance, for all its artistic glory, remained intellectually crippled, a society celebrating beautiful facades. While the structural foundations were deliberately rotten, the papacy sacrificed the certainty of mathematics for the chaos of control. Leaving Europe to fumble its way through centuries of darkness, the fear persisted long after the original texts were burned. Even generations later, the cardinals were unnerved by the sight of any accurate, complex machine. A perfectly functional clock, a well-engineered printing press, or a truly reliable lens could induce moments of panic small. Physical reminders that the clockwork god was still ticking, regardless of their theological protests. The legacy of this fear is the enduring struggle between faith and science, a chasm that was deliberately deepened and weaponized by the Renaissance papacy. They taught the world that order was terrifying and chaos was safe, a moral framework that crippled curiosity for centuries. But the idea of the perfect, predictable universe did not die. It merely went into hibernation, carried by the men who were banished from the center of power. The scholar, trekking into the cold, silent north, carried with him not just a fragment of an ancient text, but the unbreakable conviction that the universe was governed by elegant, accessible laws. He was the living proof that even the most powerful institution could not destroy an idea, whose time had come, it could only delay it. At a terrible, unforgivable cost to humanity, we leave him now, settling into his forced exile, his mind still working through the formulas that could save Europe. His small, sealed box rests beside him, a monument to the betrayal. The popes thought they had silenced him, but in his enforced solitude, the scholar became the truest guardian of the forgotten scientific age. His quiet existence is the final, compelling piece of the puzzle, leading us to the hidden truth of the knowledge that survived the fire. We must now follow the man who was erased from history. The scholar who was retreated to the north, the most brilliant part of the Vatican's technological betrayal, was not the act of burning, but the method of hiding what remained. The popes knew they could not destroy every functional blueprint. Instead, they enacted a profound, intellectual cover-up. The ciphers of the hidden index, the most dangerous mathematical formulas in engineering, schematics were not locked away. They were rewritten in plain sight, disguised as dense, confusing religious allegory, esoteric poetry, or even as decorative patterns within common prayer books. This deliberate curse turned public scripture into a private scientific text, ensuring that the forbidden truth was accessible only to those few who possessed the secret key. This calculated act of moral decay turned the Church's most sacred texts into the archive of its deepest lie. This is the truth the Church buried, hiding the forbidden's future within the Holy Word itself. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move past the smoke of the ritual and into the silent workrooms of the Vatican scriptorium. Imagine the scholars not copying scripture but painstakingly corrupting it. They are engaged in the most insidious act of intellectual warfare, transforming clear, functional scientific language into dense, impenetrable mysticism. This is where the conspiracy takes its most chilling form. Weaving the ciphers of the hidden index. The problem facing the cardinals was permanence. If a secular power were to conquer Rome, they would naturally seize the Vatican Library, the greatest collection of knowledge in the West. If the forbidden texts were simply sequestered, they would be immediately discovered. The solution, devised by the Cardinal Vespucci and his intellectual cadre, was to immunize the knowledge against discovery by rendering it functionally useless. Even if it were read by a scholar, the specific volumes targeted for this process were those containing the most robust, repeatable scientific knowledge, the formulas for metallurgy, advanced optics, and, crucially, the complex ratios for steam expansion. These functional texts were not burned entirely. They were taken to a secret cell within the scriptorium, where a small, trusted team of scribes began the work of calculated corruption. The method was known internally by the chilling phrase, translatio ad allegoriam, translation to allegory. A simple, precise equation for hydraulic pressure would be rewritten as a long, flowing poem about the weight of the soul and the flow of divine grace. The numerical ratios were substituted with references to the 7 virtues, the 12 apostles, or the 40 days of Lent. Imagine the original text stating, pressure ratio P1 to P2 must maintain a factor of 3.14 for perpetual flow. The corrupted text would read, the weight of the first sin to the second must be as the Trinity's blessing to the serpent's lie, ensuring the perpetual flow of the river of mercy. The mathematical constant pi, 3.14, was disguised as a mystical illusion. This process was designed to defeat the very nature of scientific inquiry. A future scholar reading the corrupted text would spend years trying to decipher the theological meaning, never realizing they were holding a simple, perfect engineering blueprint disguised as a sermon. The knowledge was hidden in plain sight, protected by the dense, self-referential armor of religious zealotry. The most dangerous scientific principles were not hidden in esoteric, single-copy volumes. They were encoded into the most widely available and frequently studied religious texts, the Book of Hours and the Illuminated Psalters. This was the genius and the deepest moral decay of the ciphers of the hidden index. By putting the forbidden truth into the hands of nearly every literate noble and monk, the Church ensured that the knowledge was dispersed globally, but rendered utterly harmless. The mechanical instructions for the complex gearing of the impossible device, for instance, were encoded within the decorative flourishes of the illuminated initials in a popular psalter. The number of leaves on a vine, the ratio of the height of a saint to the width of his halo, or the specific spacing between the lines of a miniature architectural drawing all contain the mathematical constants and ratios necessary to reconstruct the forbiddance technology. A monk in a distant monastery, copying the psalter by hand, would be painstakingly preserving the blueprint for an industrial revolution, believing he was merely honoring the beauty of God's word. He was an unknowing agent of the cover-up. His pious effort ensuring the preservation of the lie, the core cipher itself, was complex, requiring a key known only to the cardinals and the chief cryptographers. The key involved using a specific prayer, for example, the Pater Noster, as a numerical reference grid. A word's position in the prayer would correspond to a number, and that number would then be used to substitute the religious allegory back into a mathematical variable. This system guaranteed that the texts were safe from secular scholars, Protestant spies, or rival princes. They could translate the Latin perfectly, but without the cipher key of the prayer, the text would remain a beautiful, pious, but ultimately useless string of religious metaphor. The scribes and scholars forced to perform this work suffered immense psychological trauma. They were men who had dedicated their lives to the purity of truth and language. Now they were tasked with systematically, deliberately corrupting it. They were forced to desecrate the very text they held sacred, turning the word of God into a vessel for the lie of ignorance. Some scribes went mad, haunted by the betrayal. Others, like Brother Thomas, who used the red ink, developed their own small, desperate, coded protests, hiding tiny, honest footnotes in the margins, desperate whispers meant to guide a future reader, hoping they would one day find the key to the hidden index. The ciphers of the hidden index served not only to conceal the forbidden truth, but also to actively misdirect scientific inquiry. The Church cleverly guided the few authorized scholars toward fields of study that posed no threat to their power. They encouraged research into astrology, optics for navigation, not for telescopes, and alchemy focused purely on philosophy and mysticism, not on the functional transmutation of materials. These were safe sciences. They dealt either with things far away, stars, or things that were intentionally non-repeatable, mystical alchemy, reinforcing the chaotic, interventionist God narrative. The cardinals subtly promoted texts containing the corrupted ciphers, knowing that any scholar who seriously pursued the mathematics found in those religious allegories would be led down long, intellectually devastating dead ends. The scholar would spend a lifetime chasing the divine ratio of the Trinity, never realizing that the truth was the simple thermal expansion ratio needed for a steam engine. This brilliant Misdirection was a form of intellectual poison. The popes ensured that the brightest minds in Europe were trapped in a labyrinth of false spiritual geometry, forever pursuing answers that had been deliberately removed from the material plane. Imagine the frustration of a young, gifted Renaissance mind reading a pious text that seemed to promise hidden, profound scientific insight, only to spend years calculating and finding only chaos and contradiction. The eventual psychological result was often a retreat from reason entirely. Confirming the Church's message, human reason, when applied too zealously, leads only to madness and heresy. This failure reinforced the necessity of the Church as the sole source of ordered truth. Even as the Church itself was actively destroying the real order of the universe, despite the sophistication of the cipher, the system contained a critical, terrifying weakness: the cipher key. This physical document, which translated the religious allegories back into functional formulas, was the single most dangerous piece of paper in the Renaissance. It had to be simple enough to be used quickly by the cardinals, private agents who needed to study and replicate the forbiddance technology, but complex enough to be unbreakable if found. The key was a small vellum scroll kept in a secure location, its existence known only to the highest level of the Officium Securitas Scripturae. The loss of this key or its use by the wrong person would instantly expose the entire conspiracy. The security surrounding the cipher key was paranoid and extreme. It was never kept in the same vault as the corrupted texts. It was likely divided into two parts, stored in separate locations, one part with the Cardinal Vespucci, and the other with a trusted academic who handled the translations for the Church's private technological use. This academic was the scholar who was retreated to the north. The scholar's role was terrifyingly simple. He was the human decryptor. He was the only one in the Church's employ capable of reading the scientific truth from the religious allegory. He alone could look at a Salter's illuminated initial and see the gear ratio for a self-regulating clock. He was crucial because the ancient knowledge was too fragmented and complex to be used. Without his living expertise, the scholar's relationship with the key was a profound psychological trap. He was forced to use his genius to maintain the lie, translating the forbidden truths into practical applications, like the clean water for the cardinal's villas, while knowing that the knowledge remained locked away from the suffering public. His conscience was stained by every decryption he performed. When the inevitable moment came, when the cardinal ordered the scholar to use the key to reconstruct a final, devastating weapon from the forbidden texts, the scholar refused. He realized that his moral integrity required him to break the system. He could not stop the popes from burning the books, but he could stop them from possessing the functional key to the knowledge they had sworn to bury. His refusal triggered the final, desperate stage of the cover-up. The Church could not risk the scholar being captured, nor could they risk him revealing the ciphers of the hidden index. They could not kill him outright, for his unique decoding skill was still necessary. The compromise reached by Cardinal Vespucci was the sentence of exile and sequestration. The scholar was stripped of his half of the cipher key, and the two parts were combined and hidden deep within the Vatican. But in a final, agonizing decision, the scholar was permitted to take a single, sealed box containing his personal notes and one fragment of the original uncorrupted texts, a final, perverse act of intellectual cruelty. The popes believed they had neutralized the threat. They had locked the key away, scattered the knowledge into religious cipher, and exiled the one man who could read it. They had secured the future of chaos. The ciphers of the hidden index remain the most elegant and terrifying piece of the Vatican's technological cover-up. They are proof that the knowledge was never destroyed. It was simply turned into an intellectual time capsule, locked away inside the very texts. Meant to guide spiritual life, the conspiracy succeeded beyond the cardinal's wildest dreams. For centuries, scholars diligently copied the religious metaphors and the geometric flourishes, preserving the scientific truths they were forbidden to recognize, ensuring the darkness of the Middle Ages persisted well into the Renaissance. But the flaw in the plan lies with the exiled scholar. The popes assumed that by isolating him, they had rendered his knowledge useless. They failed to account for his profound moral integrity and his commitment to the principles of the clockwork god. The scholar, journeying north, carried with him the complete understanding of the cipher system. Even without the physical key, he knew the difference between the holy word and the hidden formula. He was the living, walking key to the hidden index. We leave him now, in the cold, clear north, away from the smoke and the splendor of Rome. He settles into his exile, his mind busy with the complex task of finding a way to share the truth he could no longer speak. His small, sealed box rests beside him, containing the only pure, uncorrupted fragment of the forbidden knowledge that survived the flames. The popes thought they had won. By locking the key in Rome, they did not realize that the key had simply walked away. Disguised as a banished scholar, his quiet mission now begins, to find a way to leak the truth into the secular world, without revealing the location of the Vatican's hidden cipher key. We must now follow the man who was erased from history. The scholar who was retreated to the north. The forbidden knowledge that the Renaissance popes burned did not vanish. It was secretly built into the very foundations of the Vatican itself. The chief imperial architect, the man who designed the era's greatest buildings, was the ultimate conspirator, forced to commit an agonizing betrayal against his own genius. He used the banned, ancient engineering principles, the same truths found in the Forbidden's blueprints, to construct the perfect, clean, healthy, and complex water systems of the Apostolic Palace. Then he was forced to swear an oath, publicly crediting his designs not to mathematics, but to divine inspiration. This lie of fabricated miracle is etched into the stone and mortar of Rome, the silent confession of the architect, a testament to the moral decay of a church that hoarded technology while letting its people suffer. This is the truth the church buried, hiding the forbidden geometry within the stones of the holy city. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the cryptographic secrecy of the ciphers and into the public, dazzling sunshine of a Renaissance construction site. Imagine the noise of chisels, the shouts of laborers, the grand scale of ambition. Yet beneath this public splendor lies a secret, a perfect hidden infrastructure of pipes and vents. Here, a brilliant mind, driven to despair, left his terrible mark. The silent confession of the architect. The architect, known simply as Maestro Andrea, was a man revered across Europe. He was a master of proportion, balance, and structural integrity. Crucially, he was one of the few scholars the popes initially trusted to analyze the forbidden Byzantine and Roman texts, the same texts that were later consigned to the ritual of the sacred flame. Maestro Andrea was tasked with creating buildings that did more than merely impress. They had to function with impossible perfection. The Apostolic Palace had to be a sanctuary from the plagues and squalor that routinely ravaged Rome. This required a constant supply of clean water, perfect ventilation, and efficient waste removal engineering challenges that were impossible to solve using the approved and deliberately flawed Renaissance techniques. Andrea's solution was to use the very knowledge the church was destroying. He took the functional, repeatable blueprints for water filtration and hydraulic pressure, the same principles that fueled the impossible device, and integrated them deep within the palace walls. Concealed from public view, the difference between the public Rome and the private Vatican was stark. In the city, water was drawn from open, contaminated sources. In the palace, Andrea built closed-loop systems with ceramic filters derived from the forbidden's knowledge of Magister Ignis, ensuring the curia drank and bathed in water of near-modern purity. This entire hidden infrastructure was Andrea's living masterpiece and his living prison. Every functioning drain, every cool, clean chamber was a constant, physical reminder of the truth. The suffering outside the walls was unnecessary. The solution was hidden in the pipes and vents he alone designed. Maestro Andrea was required to publicly maintain the fiction that his impossible feats of engineering were the result of divine favor, a sudden, beautiful revelation of God's genius. Whenever a foreign dignitary praised the palace's pristine conditions, Andrea had to bow and credit a miraculous intuition or a blessing from St. Peter rather than the rigorous, forgotten mathematics of a pagan Roman engineer. This was his silent confession. His lips spoke the lie of divine intervention, but the perfectly placed keystone, the flawless pressure regulator deep in the basement, and the mathematically precise air vents all screamed the truth of repeatable science. His true agony was the moral decay of having knowledge that could save millions, yet being forced to use it solely for the elite who mandated its destruction. During plague outbreaks, Andrea would walk through the filthy, dying streets of Rome, knowing that the simple ceramic filter he had installed in the Pope's private fountain could, if replicated, end the scourge. But to replicate it would be treason, for it would instantly expose the lie of the interventionist God. The psychological burden of this deliberate hypocrisy manifested in strange ways. Andrea became obsessed with hiding his knowledge not just from the public, but from himself. He developed a meticulous, secret language of geometric code that he inscribed into the non-load-bearing elements of his buildings, in a hidden archway, or the base of a decorative column. He would embed subtle diagrams. The mathematical ratios for advanced construction were disguised as symbolic floral patterns. The pressure rates for his hidden pipes were inscribed as the number of tassels on a carved curtain. Only another master mathematician, one who knew to look past the religious symbolism, would ever find the genuine engineering formula beneath the piety. This coded geometry was his attempt at a penance. He was preserving the knowledge for a future, more honest age, a secret archive written not on parchment but in stone. He hoped that one day a scholar would decode his beautiful structural lie and realize that the glory of the Vatican was built on the forbidden truth of a suppressed industrial revolution. The few individuals who did manage to find his coded marks minor, apprentices or observant stonemasons, were quickly neutralized by the Officium Securitas Scripturae. They were either bought, banished, or convinced that the geometric symbols were simply esoteric Masonic rituals, not functional engineering blueprints. The lie of the miracle was too powerful to allow the simple truth of mathematics to survive. The hidden hydraulic systems were a constant source of anxiety for the curia. They needed to maintain the forbidden's technology. without ever admitting its existence. This task fell entirely to Maestro Andrea. He was the only one who understood the unique alloys and the complex pressure ratios required to keep the closed-loop systems operational. When repairs were needed, the Pope's office would issue a highly secretive, coded order for ritual maintenance of the divine water source. Andrea would then enter the secret, subterranean chambers of the palace vaults known only to the highest elite. Here he would work in solitude, surrounded by the physical proof of the conspiracy, the advanced pipes, the steam regulators, and the complex gear systems that were centuries ahead of public knowledge. He was the high priest of the forbidden mechanics. His workers, a small, loyal team of deaf mutes and blind craftsmen sworn to silence, were brought in to perform the physical labor. They could see or hear nothing that could be interpreted or communicated. This team of silent laborers was the ultimate human safeguard of the architectural lie. The cost of these repairs, meticulously logged in Brother Thomas's red ink ledgers under extraordinary rites of purification, was enormous. The church was willing to spend its fortune to ensure its private plumbing remained perfect, while the public was left to drink from stagnant wells. The economic cost of maintaining the lie was vast, but the alternative, the loss of political control, was deemed catastrophic. This deliberate contrast between the opulent health inside the Vatican and the constant death outside was the ultimate expression of the moral decay of the Soter. They were not merely ignorant of the cure. They were actively sitting on the cure, using it for their own comfort while framing the suffering of their flock as a divine test. Andrea's silent confession was most visible in the design of the fountains and public water displays commissioned outside the palace. These fountains were deliberately designed to be aesthetically beautiful but mechanically inefficient. The pipes were prone to blockages, the pressure was inconsistent, and the water quality was poor. He designed them this way to create a public contrast. The public saw a beautiful fountain that worked poorly and concluded, "Such is the nature of man's flawed endeavor." They never suspected that, mere yards away, a hidden system was working with flawless, ancient precision, proving that the flaw was not in man's capability, but in the Church's policy. As Maestro Andrea aged, the weight of his silent confession grew unbearable. He knew he could not take the knowledge to his grave. The lie would be complete, but he could not write a treatise, as it would be instantly destroyed. His final act of defiance was therefore structural. His last commission was his own tomb within a secluded, modest chapel. The tomb itself was unremarkable, but its subterranean vault, designed and supervised solely by Andrea, was a masterpiece of coded confession. The vault was built using a series of interlocking stone blocks whose weight and spacing were determined by the precise ratios of steam expansion found in the forbidden texts. The tomb's structure was not random. It was a functional blueprint for the most powerful piece of suppressed technology. Only a scholar who understood that the weight of the stone equaled the pressure of the gas could decode the tomb into a working formula. Furthermore, on the inner ceiling of the hidden vault, Andrea inscribed a complex geometric pattern, a stylized celestial map. This was not a map of the heavens, but a deconstructed schematic of the impossible device. He used the celestial bodies as points to mark the pivot points and gear ratios, using the language of the sky to hide the language of the machine. This final, desperate confession in stone ensured that the forbidden's geometry was protected by the permanence of death. If any future scholar were to discover and excavate the tomb, they would be staring directly at the blueprint for the Industrial Revolution, written in the stone of a faithful servant, the Church. In its paranoid haste, never investigated the tomb's structural ratios, assuming the great architect was simply indulging in personal symbolism. They missed the fact that Andrea had successfully turned his own burial place into the ultimate archive of technological truth. The cardinals, however, were not entirely blind. They noticed Andrea's growing melancholy and his increasing philosophical discussions with the scholar who was retreated to the north. They realized the two men shared the same dangerous belief: that man's reason should not be shackled. After Andrea's quiet death, the cardinals moved swiftly to neutralize the final living threat. They could not risk the scholar decoding Andrea's tomb. The scholar, who understood the language of both mathematics and morality, was the only man who could link the silent confession in the stone to the ciphers of the hidden index in the books. The silent confession of the architect is the enduring architectural irony of the Renaissance. The most beautiful, opulent, and structurally perfect buildings were built on a foundation of lies, powered by the very knowledge that the institution swore to destroy. Andrea's moral agony is preserved in the cool, clean water of the papal palace water that is a constant, physical reminder of the truth he could not speak. The cardinals believed that, by exiling the scholar and burying the architect, they had finally secured the lie. They ensured that the two men, who held the complete knowledge of the churches, technological cover-up, the one who knew the code of the books, and the one who knew the code of the stones would never meet again, but the scholar retreating to the north carried with him the crucial piece of information, the final, specific calculation Andrea had shared with him, the numerical key needed to begin decoding the tomb's architecture. We leave the city of Rome, its magnificent buildings resting on the deep buried truth of the conspiracy. The architect's tomb stands waiting, a silent monument to the moral decay of the Soter, preserving the industrial future in the geometry of death. The confession is complete, but only the exiled scholar holds the capacity to read the final, devastating chapter. His quiet mission now begins, to use the final key to unlock the ultimate truth, and find a way to leak the forbidden technology into the world. We must now follow the man who was erased from history, the scholar who was retreated to the north. The 1,000 years of darkness following the Roman Empire were not an accident of history, but a vast, intentional crime. The economic and intellectual misery of the West was the direct result of the calculated stagnation of the West, a policy ruthlessly enforced by the Renaissance papacy. The Church knew the forbidden blueprints for the Industrial Revolution would shatter their control. Therefore, they enforced a devastating betrayal. They systematically suppressed every innovation, ensuring that agriculture remained primitive, disease remained rampant, and communication remained slow. This was the ultimate curse, keeping the population poor, fearful, and dependent on the Church's fleeting miracles for survival. The moral decay of the cardinals was the conscious choice to sacrifice Europe's progress to secure their own eternal political power. This is the truth the Church buried, trading human potential for perpetual control. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move past the coated stones of the architect and into the vast, suffering landscape of Europe. Imagine the slow, arduous labor of a peasant's life, the constant fear of famine and plague. This suffering was not a failure of destiny, but the successful execution of a grand, chilling strategy known as the calculated stagnation of the West, we examine the cold, political logic that justified centuries of poverty. The concept of calculated stagnation was the political expression of the theological fear we have previously explored, the fear of the clockwork God. If man could solve his own material problems, his need for the spiritual mediator would vanish. Therefore, the Church had to ensure that the material problems remained insoluble by human reason alone. This required a systematic, four-part mandate of control. Firstly, the enforced simplicity of agriculture. The forbidden ancient texts contained revolutionary knowledge of soil rotation, fertilization, and efficient irrigation. The Church ensured that these concepts were eradicated. Instead, they promoted agricultural practices that were superstitious, resource-intensive, and yielded only marginal returns, keeping the vast majority of the population perpetually one bad harvest away from famine. This permanent hunger ensured a humble, supplicating flock. Secondly, the standardization of disease. The repeated cycles of plague and waterborne illness were not just tolerated, they were viewed as stabilizing factors. The plague outbreaks, while terrifying, constantly reinforced the Church's narrative of God's unpredictable judgment, making the public desperate for the solace of the last rites and the promise of the afterlife. The moral decay here is profound. A leadership that viewed the death of its people as a necessary mechanism for political stability. The architect, Maestro Andrea, knew this chilling truth. He built the perfect, clean water systems for the Curia, sealing off their health while actively ensuring the public infrastructure remained primitive. The healthy cardinals, living in their engineered perfection, made the conscious, daily choice to uphold calculated stagnation outside their gates. The third pillar was the suppression of communication. A predictable, repeatable printing press, the kind the forbidden blueprints described, would flood Europe with ideas, secular texts, and most fatally, the accurate, scientific schematics that could break the stagnation. The Church ensured that printing remained slow, expensive, and heavily restricted, maintaining a bottleneck of knowledge that they alone controlled. The calculated stagnation of the West was enforced not just through the burning of books, but through the continuous psychological destruction of any emerging hope or talent. The primary enforcement agent was the subtle but pervasive culture of theological suspicion. Any inventor, engineer, or particularly successful farmer who achieved success that was too repeatable or too profound was immediately flagged by the local clergy. Their success was framed not as ingenuity, but as a potential pact with dark forces. Imagine a young craftsman who perfects a new loom, one based on simple, forgotten principles that vastly increase textile production. This small, regional success threatens the economic monopolies of the powerful Florentine and Venetian merchants, who are secretly allied with the papacy. The Church intervenes. The craftsman is accused not of economic rivalry, but of sorcery. His loom is publicly destroyed in a theatrical ceremony, and his success is erased. The message sent across Europe is devastatingly clear. Innovation is inherently dangerous to the soul. This constant, systemic discouragement became the invisible hand that halted the technological progress of the West. It fostered a deep, institutionalized belief that ambition was a curse and that the safe path was always the one that led back to the accepted, primitive methods. The life in exile of the scholar who was retreated to the north serves as the ultimate testament to this calculated policy. He was the most dangerous man in Europe because he possessed the complete solution to stagnation. He knew the clean water schematics, the efficient agricultural formulas, and the principles of predictable mechanics. His banishment to the farthest reaches of Europe was the Church's way of quarantining the cure. By sending him to a remote, intellectually isolated location, they effectively neutralized his genius, ensuring that the knowledge of the Industrial Revolution remained frozen in his mind and in the small, sealed box he carried. The popes, of course, reaped immense economic benefits from this policy. The enforced stagnation of the lower classes ensured that the few valuable resources, luxury goods, spices, and rare metals remained controlled by a tiny, powerful elite. The Church, as the dominant landowner and creditor, thrived in an economy defined by artificial scarcity and technological weakness. This was the core. Moral decay. The Renaissance popes were not merely resisting progress. They were profiting from the poverty they intentionally sustained. The calculated stagnation of the West successfully kept Europe in a state of controlled weakness for centuries. The true measure of the crime is the unimaginable human cost, the millions of lives lost to preventable diseases, the endless toil endured in the fields, and the profound intellectual darkness that shrouded the continent. When the Industrial Revolution finally did arrive, centuries later, it exploded with a violence and speed born of that long, sustained suppression. It was a backlash, a sudden, furious release of the technological potential that the Vatican had intentionally locked away. The seeds of the Enlightenment's conflict with the Church were sown directly in the ashes of the ritual of the sacred flame, but the lie was never absolute. The truth of the suppressed revolution remains, coded in the stone of the architect's tomb and carried in the mind of the exiled scholar. The Church succeeded in slowing history, but it failed to stop the inevitable triumph of repeatable science. The scholar, now alone in the silent north, is the last living link to the forbidden's past. He holds the key, the knowledge to connect the architect's structural confession to the original ancient blueprints. His quiet, determined life is the antithesis of the stagnation policy. He will find a way to leak the truth, not to the popes, but to the secular world he was exiled to protect. His mission is fraught with danger, for the Church's agents still patrol the shadows, searching for the slightest flicker of the forbidden's knowledge. The scholar's first step is to use his coded message to reach out to the world he left behind. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication. The unsent letter to Vienna. The great crime of the Renaissance papacy was not just the burning of the forbidden's blueprints, but the creation of a vast institutional deception known as the Treaty of the False Miracle. This was a secret, unwritten agreement among the cardinals to publicly promote only those technological feats that were so complex and inexplicable that the public would instantly believe they were divine, thus reinforcing the lie of the Church's mediation. The simple, repeatable science that solved common problems was brutally suppressed, while theatrical, difficult-to-understand false miracles were financed and celebrated. This profound betrayal and moral decay ensured that technology itself became a tool of political confusion, a brilliant, terrifying spectacle designed to keep humanity in intellectual darkness. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the quiet solitude of the banned scribe to the public square, where spectacle reigns supreme. Imagine a scene of great theatrical wonder, a machine that appears to move by magic, a light source that seems to burn without fuel, This is the stage upon which the lie was performed, the treaty of the false miracle. This unwritten code governed which truths were allowed to shimmer and which were condemned to ash. The treaty of the false miracle was born directly from the fear of the clockwork god. The cardinals understood that they could not completely halt human ingenuity. The urge to invent was too powerful. Their policy became one of control by co-option. If an invention could not be suppressed, it must be spectacularized. The criteria for a safe invention were chillingly clear. An invention was allowed only if it was non-reproducible, so complex that only a handful of church-sanctioned minds could even attempt it. Aesthetically baffling, it must look like magic. Defying easy explanation, non-utilitarian, it must solve a spectacular, non-essential problem like calculating the precise moment of Easter rather than a practical, essential problem like purifying water. The goal was to demonstrate power without accessibility. The approved inventions served only to reinforce the public belief that advanced knowledge was inherently difficult, mysterious, and therefore divine. Consider the great astronomical clocks commissioned by the popes. These were often magnificent, complex devices, using advanced gearing derived from the forbidden texts that the architect Maestro Andrea had preserved. They were capable of accurate celestial calculation, a form of repeatable science. But they were celebrated as miracles of piety, proof that God had granted the Church the exclusive keys to the cosmos. The public was left in awe of the complexity, never realizing that the mechanism was simply the application of mathematics that had been common knowledge in Alexandria centuries earlier. The clock became a symbol not of human ingenuity, but of papal privilege. In direct opposition to these theatrical displays, the Church ruthlessly suppressed the easy truths. A simple, efficient mechanical loom that could quickly weave common cloth was dangerous, because its success was easily repeatable and understandable by a layman. It democratized wealth and reduced reliance on the Church's charity. Therefore, the loom was labeled a device of the devil and destroyed. The moral calculus was perverse. Complexity was safe if it led to confusion. Simplicity was dangerous if it led to competence. The treaty of the false miracle was a declaration that confusion was necessary for salvation. The enforcement of the treaty of the false miracle was a subtle masterstroke of economic control. By limiting technical ingenuity to the sphere of non-essential spectacle, the Church ensured that the most lucrative and vital industries, agriculture, textiles, and transport, remained technologically primitive. This calculated stagnation created guaranteed, consistent profits for the papal state and its allied merchant houses. A slow, inefficient, plague-ridden economy ensured that competition was low and labor was cheap and disposable. The false miracle was a brilliant distraction that masked a vast, exploitative financial system. Whenever a truly brilliant secular inventor emerged, the cardinals had two choices. If the invention was too simple, it was destroyed, as with the efficient loom. If the invention was complex and spectacular, like a magnificent but useless automaton, it was immediately bought and opted. The Church would shower the inventor with praise and commissions for similar, equally non-utilitarian devices, effectively removing the genius from the dangerous pursuit of practical, repeatable science. The inventor was thus neutralized, their potential channeled into producing theatrical instruments of political propaganda. Imagine the despair of a true engineer, forced to spend his days building a magnificent, gold-plated planetarium when he knew the blueprints for a life-saving water pump were gathering dust in a Vatican vault. He was rewarded for his theatrical failure and punished for his potential success. This was the quiet, agonizing price of the false miracle. The Church formalized this system by creating new papal commissions for the study of esoteric fields such as angelic hierarchies or the symbolism of ancient monuments, while simultaneously and secretly dismantling existing commissions for practical mechanics or hydraulics. They were effectively giving scholars safe, useless work to keep them away from the dangerous. Functional truth. The psychological effect of the Treaty of the False Miracle persists even today. It instilled in the West a deep-seated suspicion of technological simplicity and a profound, often irrational awe of complexity and spectacle. The Church successfully taught society to look to the skies for answers that were buried beneath its feet. The only people who truly understood the full dimensions of this moral decay were those who had seen the forbiddance. Truth, like the exiled scholar, who was now carrying the blueprints for a genuine, useful revolution into the North. His challenge was not just to reveal the truth, but to do so in a way that the world, conditioned to expect miracles, would believe in simplicity. The Treaty of the False Miracle was a triumph of political theater over moral integrity. It secured the Church's financial and spiritual monopoly by ensuring that the true, repeatable power of science remained a private weapon, safely locked away behind the spectacle of the impossible. But the lie contained a critical vulnerability, the uncompromising morality of the exiled scholar. He had witnessed the construction of the false miracles. He knew the useless complexity of the astronomical clocks, and he held the key to the simple, practical genius they were hiding. He understood that the greatest threat to the Church's power was not a competing army, but a single, reproducible, clean glass of water. His mission is now to break the calculated stagnation, not with a spectacular invention, but with a humble, irrefutable truth. He must communicate the existence of the forbidden knowledge without falling into the trap of the false miracle. He cannot simply announce the existence of the blueprints. The world is trained to disbelieve simple truth. He must find a secure way to leak a small, undeniable fragment of the knowledge to a trustworthy, secular patron, a man whose influence is far from Rome, and whose mind is still open to the idea of repeatable, non-miraculous progress. The scholar, now deep in exile, settles upon a plan. He will use a subtle, coded message disguised as a simple inquiry, targeting a merchant known for his neutrality and his vast network. This message must be designed to pique scientific curiosity while remaining entirely harmless. If intercepted by the Church's agents, he will compose a letter to the one city where logic still holds some sway. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication. The unsent letter to Vienna. The decision to condemn Europe to centuries of darkness was not made in a written decree, but sealed by a secret, unspoken vow, the silent agreement of the cardinals. This unholy pact required every powerful member of the Curia to understand and uphold the colossal lie that forbidden technology had to be destroyed to preserve the spiritual order. The cardinals, men of immense intellect, knowingly traded material prosperity for political stability, viewing the suffering of the masses as a necessary sacrifice for the Church's survival. This betrayal was their ultimate moral decay, a private understanding that transformed them from spiritual leaders into ruthless political conspirators, forever bound by the curse of their shared, deliberate crime. This is the truth the Church buried, found in the terrifying silence between powerful men. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the public splendor of the papal court to the private, marble severity of the curia's inner sanctum. Imagine the cardinals gathered around a massive wooden table. No documents are signed, no words of treason are spoken. Yet, in the shared understanding of their eyes, the fate of Europe is sealed. This terrifying unwritten rule of the silent agreement of the cardinals is the true foundation of the conspiracy. The silent agreement was necessary because the crime, the systematic destruction of the means of human progress, was too vast and too morally repulsive to ever be committed to paper. Any written evidence would have instantly invited civil war, internal revolt, and the collapse of the Church's spiritual authority. The pact was based on a shared, chilling rationale: necessity trumps morality. The cardinals convinced one another that the theological weight of repeatable science made the Church's political survival the highest moral good. If the Church fell, they argued, all of Christendom would fall into chaos. Therefore, preserving the institution, even at the cost of centuries of human suffering, was an act of profound, if dark, responsibility. This shared rationale created an unbreakable bond of shared guilt. Every cardinal was a silent accomplice in the ritual of the sacred flame, every one of them benefiting from the resultant calculated stagnation of the West. No one could betray the conspiracy without simultaneously confessing his own colossal crime. The silence was their shield, and the shared sin was their glue. When a new cardinal was brought into the inner circle, the truth was never revealed directly. Instead, he was subjected to a series of subtle tests and presentations. He would be shown the perfectly engineered, clean water systems Maestro Andrea had hidden in the palace, contrasted with the dying Roman populace outside. He would be presented with Brother Thomas's ledger, detailing the massive, unexplained expenditures marked in the red ink. The final test was the showing of the impossible device, or its schematics, the absolute proof of the suppressed technology. The new cardinal was then simply asked, "Do you believe in the necessary order of the Holy See?" His answer, given with the weight of the undeniable scientific truth before him, was his entry fee into the conspiracy. He wasn't asked to swear an oath. He was asked to acknowledge the lie. The silent agreement of the cardinals was a brilliant tactical solution to a moral problem. Because the conspiracy was unwritten, the Church could officially maintain complete moral innocence on the public stage. They could publicly condemn heresy, preach charity, and celebrate the magnificent yet useless creations governed by the treaty of the false miracle. The duality of their existence, one part devout leader, one part ruthless conspirator, was the very essence of their moral decay. They learned to live with the profound dissonance, compartmentalizing the truth of the clockwork God into a political necessity. The agreement gave the cardinals immense economic power over secular rivals. They knew that no prince or king could effectively modernize his state because the core technological knowledge was locked away or destroyed. This intentional technological weakness ensured that the Church, with its ancient, stable wealth and control over a stagnant economy, remained the dominant financial force in Europe. They were profiting from the collective ignorance they had engineered. The Inquisition, which publicly hunted down theological heresy, served as the agreement's quiet external enforcement arm. While it was publicly focused on dissent, it also acted as the primary agent for neutralizing any scholar who came close to rediscovering the forbidden technology. A mathematician who proved the predictability of celestial motion was just as dangerous as a man who denied the virgin birth, because both threatened the Church's essential spiritual economy. The Inquisition was the iron hand of the silent agreement. The greatest fear among the cardinals was not external discovery, but internal collapse. They feared that one of their own, burdened by the guilt of the silent confession of the architect or the sheer moral horror of the plague, might break the agreement and leak the truth. This fear led to constant, pervasive monitoring within the Curia. Every cardinal was watched by every other. The agreement was maintained not by loyalty, but by mutual suspicion and guaranteed destruction. The system ensured that any man who tried to confess the truth would be immediately isolated, discredited, and erased a fate far worse than the burning of any book, the silent. Agreement of the cardinals was a near-perfect conspiracy. It secured the Church's power for centuries and successfully buried the knowledge of the Industrial Revolution. Its single, fatal flaw was its inability to account for the unwavering integrity of the scholar. The cardinals believed that by exiling the scholar who was retreated to the north, they had neutralized the last living threat. They calculated that his isolation would break his will and that the distance would prevent him from ever accessing the necessary codes. They failed to understand that the exiled scholar, armed with the final secret calculation from the architect's tomb and the complete knowledge of the ciphers of the hidden index, was now free from the coercion of the agreement. He was outside the sphere of their moral decay. His quiet exile became his greatest weapon. The popes and cardinals, bound by their secret pact, are still searching the archives, fearful of what they burned. But the solution to their long-term stability, the blueprints for a superior world, is now in the hands of the one man they unanimously agreed to forget. The silence of the Curia is about to be shattered by a voice from the north. The scholar, far from the smoke and marble, is ready to act. He has composed a message designed to bypass the Church's espionage and find the one man capable of funding the truth. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication. The unsent letter to Vienna. The crime of the Renaissance papacy was not an isolated act of suppression. It was a devastating continuation of a much older betrayal. The cardinals, through their secret historical archives, knew the full truth behind the fall of the legendary Library of Alexandria. It was not destroyed by accident or a simple siege. It was subject to a vast, calculated purge of dangerous scientific knowledge. The popes, recognizing the same forbidden technological threat in the ancient Roman blueprints, consciously decided to replicate the crime, ensuring the intellectual darkness of the Middle Ages persisted. This act of moral decay proved that the Church's destruction of the Industrial Revolution was the final, terrible chapter of a millennia-long curse against human reason. This is the truth the Church buried, carrying the torch of an ancient destruction into the Renaissance. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the secret Roman sanctums backward through time, to the dusty, sun-bleached shores of Egypt, to the great intellectual heart of the ancient world. We seek the dark inspiration for the Vatican's modern crime, the echoes of Alexandria. This ancient failure, studied and weaponized by the popes, became the chilling justification for the calculated stagnation of the West. The forbidden blueprints that the cardinals consigned to the ritual of the sacred flame were often copies of copies. Fragments of knowledge that originated long ago in the great cultural melting pots of the ancient world. Particularly Alexandria. The popes, unlike public scholars, had access to the church's ultra-secret archive, a vast collection of documents spanning the early Christian era. These archives contain not only theological histories, but eyewitness accounts, compiled by early Christian scholars regarding the final, devastating collapse of the Alexandrian library. These accounts did not speak of a singular, accidental fire. Instead, they detailed a systematic, decades-long purge led by various powerful factions, political, spiritual, and military, who all recognized the same profound danger. Repeatable science. The Alexandrian library was destroyed because it housed the fully realized principles of the clockwork God, detailed schematics for steam power, automatic doors, advanced optics, and sophisticated hydraulics. These were solutions that were too effective, too easily demonstrable, and too secular to survive in an era demanding spiritual conformity and political control. The Renaissance cardinals, reading these secret accounts, were gripped by a terrible recognition. They realized that the forbidden Byzantine texts they possessed were not new heresies, but merely re-expressions of the ancient suppressed truth. The principles that threatened the divine authority in 1500 AD were the exact same principles that threatened the
spiritual and political authorities in 300 AD. This realization solidified their resolve and hardened their moral decay. They did not see the Alexandrian destruction as a tragedy, but as a historical precedent, a necessary lesson in institutional survival. The destruction of the Industrial Revolution became, in their minds, an act of historical duty, completing the work that the ancient world had failed to finish. They were ensuring that the echoes of Alexandria would be silenced forever. The terrifying link between the Roman blueprints and the Alexandrian scrolls was the specific, easily reproducible knowledge of optics and lens grinding. The Alexandrian scholars had perfected lenses that could magnify the stars and the minuscule complexity of the world, revealing an order far beyond the human eye. The cardinals knew that a powerful lens was the ultimate threat to the chaotic, interventionist God narrative. If a man could see the perfect, predictable gears of the heavens, proving the clockwork God, or the tiny organized world of bacteria, leading to germ theory, the entire structure of spiritual mystery would crumble. The lens made the invisible visible, stripping the divine of its power to hide. The secret accounts confirmed that the destruction of the Alexandrian library was prioritized specifically to eliminate all knowledge of this forbidden optics. The Renaissance cardinals were therefore meticulous in ensuring that the optics formulas in their own forbidden texts were among the first to be consigned to the flame. They learned from the past: destroy the lens before the observer sees the truth. The echoes of Alexandria provided the cardinals with a profound, final justification for the silent agreement. They viewed themselves as standing at the great hinge of history. If they failed to suppress the technology, they believed they would be responsible for a collapse of faith greater than the fall of Rome itself. They were committing moral decay, not out of personal greed, but out of a misguided sense of historical responsibility. This narrative allowed them to sleep at night. They were not murderers, they were preventative historians, ensuring the spiritual survival of the West by sacrificing its material comfort. Ironically, the reason the forbidden blueprint survived long enough to reach Rome was because fragments of the Alexandrian knowledge had been secretly preserved by scholars in the Eastern Byzantine Empire, men who resisted the destructive fervor. It was these same Byzantine fragments that the Vatican later consolidated and attempted to destroy en masse. but a few final coded pieces of this ancient, twice-suppressed knowledge managed to escape the final purge. They were the private possession of the scholar who was retreated to the north. The scholar carried not just modern Roman engineering knowledge, but the final, pure echoes of Alexandria, ancient formulas for optics and precision mechanics, transcribed onto a single, priceless sheet of vellum. The echoes of Alexandria served as the ultimate warning for the exiled scholar. He knew that the knowledge he possessed was not only forbidden by the Pope, but had been hunted by powerful forces for over 1,000 years. His mission was therefore not just to save the Renaissance, but to finally break the ancient curse that had plagued Western civilization. He recognized that his one piece of ancient, uncorrupted vellum, the pure echo of Alexandria, was his most dangerous and most valuable asset. It was the only fragment of knowledge that had never been tainted by the Pope's allegorical ciphers of the hidden index. The scholar, now alone in the silent north, understood his place. He was the last Alexandrian, the final keeper of the technological truth. He could not send the entire blueprint to a patron. It would invite immediate destruction. He had to send a fragment of an echo, a small, undeniable piece of information that would prove the existence of the conspiracy without giving away the full extent of the forbidden knowledge. He decided to use the simplest, most harmless piece of information from the Alexandrian fragments, a precise mathematical ratio for currency assay, a formula that would allow a secular power to test the purity of gold and silver with perfect, repeatable accuracy, thus breaking the Church's financial secrecy. He carefully composed a coded message disguising the financial formula as a philosophical riddle and prepared to send it to the powerful, independent merchant prince in Austria. This message, carrying the ancient wisdom of Alexandria, was his first act of resistance against the calculated stagnation of the West. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication. The unsent letter to Vienna. The darkest secret of the Renaissance papacy lies in the ultimate paradox of power, the moral decay of the soter, the corruption of the supposed savior. The cardinals, whose sacred duty was to protect and guide humanity, committed the ultimate betrayal by choosing to actively sustain global suffering. They suppressed the forbidden blueprints for medicine and clean water, knowing this cruelty was necessary to maintain their political control and economic dominance. The lie was simple: salvation through dependence. This conscious decision to profit from the misery they could easily cure is the profound curse that marked the institution, turning the Church from a shepherd into a calculated agent of moral decay. This is the truth the Church buried, proving that the Savior was the greatest betrayer. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move from the external acts of burning and banishment into the inner consciousness of the men who ruled Rome. Imagine the weight of their choices, the immense power they held, and the daily deliberate corruption of that power. The moral decay of the soter is not about simple greed, but about the terrifying cold logic used to justify monstrous cruelty in the name of a greater good. The title soter means savior or deliverer. The Renaissance popes and the Curia saw themselves politically and spiritually as the designated soters of Western civilization. This perception was the foundation of their moral decay. To save Christendom from the chaos of secular truth and the dangers of the clockwork god, they concluded that they were required to commit temporary, systemic evil. The internal reasoning was chillingly rational. They believed that rapid technological advancement would lead to immediate moral and spiritual collapse, damning countless souls to eternal hellfire. Therefore, by prolonging the physical suffering of the present, the plagues, the poverty, the famine, they were saving the immortal souls of future generations. The suffering of the material world was the necessary price paid for the security of the spiritual realm. This was the ultimate expression of moral decay, turning the act of suppression into an act of salvation. Consider the hidden truth Maestro Andrea built into the Vatican walls, the perfect, forbidden water systems. The cardinals, benefiting from this engineered health, were daily confronted with the proof of the cure. Yet their agreement was firm. They would allow thousands to die of waterborne illness every summer because the survival of the Church's authority, the true soter in their view, was dependent on the unpredictability of disease. A cure that came from a priest was divine. A cure that came from a predictable pipe was heresy. The decaying morality was self-perpetuating. Once they had made the initial, terrible choice to burn the blueprints, every subsequent act, from the coded ciphers of the hidden index to the exile of the scholar, was justified as a necessary means of upholding the first sacrifice. They became trapped in a descending spiral of calculated cruelty, where the lie was always easier to sustain than the truth. The immense weight of the moral decay of the soter inevitably led to psychological erosion among the cardinals. They were brilliant men, forced to live a permanent, magnificent lie. They knew the formulas, they used the secret health systems, and they had read the ancient accounts detailing the technological clarity of the past. To cope with this internal betrayal, they developed mechanisms of radical denial. They cultivated a profound, almost manic devotion to the theatrical aspects of their role, the elaborate ceremonies, the public acts of charity, and the grand displays governed by the treaty. He understood the necessity of their lie, but rejected their justification. He knew that their decision was driven by the fear of losing control, not the genuine love of souls. The scholar's pure, unwavering moral compass, which valued the simple, repeatable truth over political power, became the living accusation against the decayed soter. His quiet, determined mission now is to prove that the decay was not accidental, but intentional, and that the cure has been available all along. The moral decay of the soter is the tragic core of the Vatican's secret history. It is a haunting reminder that in the hands of absolute power, the highest spiritual calling can be twisted into the most profound act of human betrayal. The suffering of centuries was the consequence of a single, rationalized, morally corrupt choice. The cardinals, in their grand tombs, rest upon the knowledge that they secured the institution, but lost their honor. They achieved stability through sin. But the lie is vulnerable. The scholar, now isolated in the north, holds the key not just to the technical blueprints, but to the moral documentation. The proof that the plagues and famines were sustained by deliberate policy. His moral clarity is the single greatest threat to the Church's legacy of assumed goodness. He must now use his knowledge to strike at the heart of the soter's economic base, the financial control that the Church maintained through centuries of calculated stagnation. He will use a subtle ancient mathematical formula, a whisper of the echoes of Alexandria, to introduce financial uncertainty into the stable economy that the cardinal so carefully constructed. His message is ready. It is a carefully worded, coded challenge to the Church's financial secrecy,
aimed at the one secular power strong enough to act. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication, the unsent letter to Vienna. The most tragic consequence of the Vatican's technological betrayal is not what was burned, but what was lost. The ghost of the steam-powered age. The forbidden blueprints destroyed by the popes represented not just theoretical knowledge, but a fully realized ancient path to a mechanized modern world. The Church's decision to commit moral decay and sustain the calculated stagnation killed an entire era of human progress. An age of efficient factories, rapid transport, and advanced medicine that should have dawned centuries earlier. This lost future haunts the present, a perpetual curse of what might have been, a silent, steam-powered ghost that proves the popes buried the greatest human revolution in history. This is the truth the Church buried, the sound of a world that never got to turn its gears. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move beyond the political debates of the cardinals and into the haunting realm of possibility. Imagine the contrast, the slow, arduous labor of a Renaissance peasant versus the smooth, rhythmic efficiency of a Victorian factory. That gap, that vast chasm of time and suffering, is occupied by the ghost of the steam-powered age, a world of functional clarity that was purposefully unmade by the saviors. The ghost we seek is woven into the surviving fragments of the forbidden blueprints. The intricate gears, the pressure ratios, and the boiler designs discovered by Maestro Andrea and the exiled scholar. They were not mere sketches, they were the fully realized schematics for a mechanized future. Imagine what the world lost. Not just a powerful engine, but the ability to mechanize textile production, lifting millions out of repetitive, back-breaking domestic labor. Imagine ships that did not rely on the unpredictable whims of the wind, but on predictable steam power, linking continents with reliable speed, ending the isolation that allowed the calculated stagnation to thrive. The ghost of this age is most tragically felt in the lost revolution of medicine. The steam engine's principles could have immediately led to advanced water pumps and widespread sanitation, the only true answer to the constant cycle of plagues. The burning of the steam blueprints was thus an act of mass murder by inaction, ensuring that the masses remained fearful, supplicating, and dependent on the Church's limited, ineffective spiritual remedies. Try to hear the sounds of this vanished age, the steady hiss of pressure escaping, the clank, clank, clank of a predictable, functioning factory line, the deep thrum of a boat moving reliably upstream. These were the sounds of repeatable science, the sounds that the Church deemed a curse upon the spiritual life of man. The cardinals in their marble villas lived in a silent, slow world of manual labor and spiritual anxiety, sustained by the lie of the false miracle. They successfully killed the sound of the steam engine, replacing it with the sound of the tolling bell, which reinforced the unpredictable, terrifying nature of time and death. The exiled scholar, trekking into the cold, silent north, carried with him the ultimate pieces of this ghost, the final, detailed fragments of the boiler and pressure regulator design. He was the last living link to the functional reality of the steam age. He understood that his mission was not merely to send a message, but to reawaken a ghost, to introduce the possibility of this forgotten world back into the consciousness of the present. The scholar knew that he could not release the full, complex design of the steam engine. The church's agents would instantly recognize the forbidden knowledge and destroy the communication. He had to be subtle. He had to leak a fragment of the ghost that was valuable enough to be pursued, yet obscure enough to bypass the initial censorship. His solution was to choose the most benign, yet the most revolutionary piece of the ancient knowledge, the precise, non-alchemical formula for measuring metal purity, a direct echo from Alexandria. This formula, if used, would expose the widespread practice of currency debasement and financial fraud that the papal allies used to sustain their power. Why this specific formula? Because the steam engine and all repeatable science rests on precision and certainty. The church thrived on uncertainty, especially in financial dealings. By introducing certainty into the currency, by giving a secular power the ability to know the exact, repeatable value of their coin, the scholar would strike a crippling blow against the moral decay of the Soter, attacking the very foundations of their economic lie. The formula itself was simple, elegant, and mathematically undeniable, the perfect weapon against the church's system of chaos. It was a fragment of the clockwork God principle applied to finance. The scholar's desperate task now was to embed this formula into a message that appeared to be a harmless philosophical inquiry. He had to use the language of metaphor, the ciphers of the hidden index, to hide the language of mathematics. He chose to send his plea to Vienna, a city far from Rome, ruled by a powerful family known for its intellectual curiosity. His letter was composed in the long, cold nights of his exile, the words heavy with the weight of the ghost of the steam-powered age that he carried in his memory. It was a plea for help, a cry for a second chance for a world he knew could be better. The letter itself became the final piece of the conspiracy's narrative, the first act of active resistance. The paper is thin, the script is small, and the code is almost invisible. The fate of the Industrial Revolution now rests on whether this message can bypass the Church's vast network of spies and reach its intended target. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication, the unsent letter to Vienna.
He understood the necessity of their lie, but rejected their justification. He knew that their decision was driven by the fear of losing control, not the genuine love of souls. The scholar's pure, unwavering moral compass, which valued the simple, repeatable truth over political power, became the living accusation against the decayed Soter. His quiet, determined mission now is to prove that the decay was not accidental, but intentional, and that the cure has been available all along. The moral decay of the Soter is the tragic core of the Vatican's secret history. It is a haunting reminder that in the hands of absolute power, the highest spiritual calling can be twisted into the most profound act of human betrayal. The suffering of centuries was the consequence of a single, rationalized, morally corrupt choice. The cardinals, in their grand tombs, rest upon the knowledge that they secured the institution, but lost their honor. They achieved stability through sin. But the lie is vulnerable. The scholar, now isolated in the north, holds the key not just to the technical blueprints, but to the moral documentation, the proof that the plagues and famines were sustained by deliberate policy. His moral clarity is the single greatest threat to the Church's legacy of assumed goodness. He must now use his knowledge to strike at the heart of the Soter's economic base, the financial control that the Church maintained through centuries of calculated stagnation. He will use a subtle, ancient mathematical formula, a whisper of the echoes of Alexandria, to introduce financial uncertainty into the stable economy that the cardinals so carefully constructed. His message is ready. It is a carefully worded, coded challenge to the Church's financial secrecy, aimed at the one secular power strong enough to act. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication, the unsent letter to Vienna. The most tragic consequence of the Vatican's technological betrayal is not what was burned, but what was lost. The ghost of the steam-powered age. The forbidden blueprints destroyed by the popes represented not just theoretical knowledge, but a fully realized ancient path to a mechanized, modern world. The Church's decision to commit moral decay and sustain the calculated stagnation killed an entire era of human progress, an age of efficient factories, rapid transport, and advanced medicine that should have dawned centuries earlier. This lost future haunts the present, a perpetual curse of what might have been, a silent, steam-powered ghost that proves the popes buried the greatest human revolution in history. This is the truth the Church buried, the sound of a world that never got to turn its gears. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move beyond the political debates of the cardinals and into the haunting realm of possibility. Imagine the contrast, the slow, arduous labor of a Renaissance peasant versus the smooth, rhythmic efficiency of a Victorian factory. That gap, that vast chasm of time and suffering, is occupied by the ghost of the steam-powered age, a world of functional clarity that was purposefully unmade by the saviors. The ghost we seek is woven into the surviving fragments of the forbidden blueprints, the intricate gears, the pressure ratios, and the boiler designs discovered by Maestro Andrea and the exiled scholar. They were not mere sketches, they were the fully realized schematics for a mechanized future. Imagine what the world lost. Not just a powerful engine, but the ability to mechanize textile production, lifting millions out of repetitive, back-breaking domestic labor. Imagine ships that did not rely on the unpredictable whims of the wind, but on predictable steam power, linking continents with reliable speed, ending the isolation that allowed the calculated stagnation to thrive. The ghost of this age is most tragically felt in the lost revolution of medicine. The steam engine's principles could have immediately led to advanced water pumps and widespread sanitation, the only true answer to the constant cycle of plagues. The burning of the steam blueprints was thus an act of mass murder by inaction, ensuring that the masses remained fearful, supplicating, and dependent on the Church's limited, ineffective spiritual remedies. Try to hear the sounds of this vanished age. The steady hiss of pressure escaping, the clank, clank, clank of a predictable, functioning factory line, the deep thrum of a boat moving reliably upstream. These were the sounds of repeatable science, the sounds that the Church deemed a curse upon the spiritual life of man. The cardinals in their marble villas lived in a silent, slow world of manual labor and spiritual anxiety, sustained by the lie of the false miracle. They successfully killed the sound of the steam engine, replacing it with the sound of the tolling bell, which reinforced the unpredictable, terrifying nature of time and death. The Renaissance papacy won the war, but they failed to extinguish the fire. The true curse of the Great Vatican cover-up is the fire that still burns in the library's shadow. The cardinals believed their betrayal, the destruction of the forbidden blueprints, was absolute. Yet the forbidden truth survived, not in books, but as a perpetual absence, the knowledge of what the world should have been. This haunting realization that centuries of darkness were self-imposed became the final, desperate lie. The fire that burned the books merely forged a hidden, unbreakable conviction in the minds of the exiled. The moral decay of the Soter created a ghost of progress, a relentless, quiet yearning for the future that only the scholar can now attempt to satisfy. This is the truth the Church buried, the lingering heat of a revolution they could not stop. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We stand at the end of our search, looking back across the centuries of the Great Deception. We have witnessed the burning, the coded confessions, the moral decay, and the long, quiet exile. The smoke of the ritual of the sacred flame has long cleared, but the heat remains, a philosophical warmth in the cold stone of the Vatican. This lingering realization, the fire that still burns in the library's shadow, is the final, soft answer to the colossal crime. The shadow cast by the burning library is not merely physical, it is the shadow of intellectual absence. The papacy successfully removed the physical proof of the Industrial Revolution, but they could not erase the logical necessity of the knowledge. Every famine, every unnecessary death from plague, every delay in transport, each of these failures screamed the existence of the missing solution. This absence became a constant, invisible source of intellectual tension for subsequent generations. Scholars would constantly hit roadblocks in their work that they felt intuitively should not be there. Architects struggled with structural problems that simpler Roman methods had solved. Scientists sought clarity in the stars that was hidden by the lack of proper optics. They were all haunted by the ghost of the steam-powered age, a world that felt mathematically possible, but historically out of reach. The Church's greatest psychological weapon was this engineered frustration. They fostered a belief that failure was the natural condition of man, born of his sin, rather than the result of a deliberate, sustained intellectual blockade. This was the lingering heat of the fire, the constant, subtle pressure to accept mediocrity as divine will. Yet the fire still burns. It burns in the small, fused artifacts discovered in the subvaults, the lumps of bronze and vellum that resisted total annihilation. These fragments, the ashes of the Archimedes Code, are physical proof that the destruction was not absolute. They are the smoldering embers of truth, forever preserved in the heart of the lie. The cardinals, even if they forgot the formulas, could never erase the existence of these strange, anachronistic lumps.
He understood the necessity of their lie, but rejected their justification. He knew that their decision was driven by the fear of losing control, not the genuine love of souls. The scholar's pure, unwavering moral compass, which valued the simple, repeatable truth over political power, became the living accusation against the decayed Soter. His quiet, determined mission now is to prove that the decay was not accidental, but intentional, and that the cure has been available all along. The moral decay of the Soter is the tragic core of the Vatican's secret history. It is a haunting reminder that in the hands of absolute power, the highest spiritual calling can be twisted into the most profound act of human betrayal. The suffering of centuries was the consequence of a single, rationalized, morally corrupt choice. The cardinals in their grand tombs rest upon the knowledge that they secured the institution but lost their honor. They achieved stability through sin, but the lie is vulnerable. The scholar, now isolated in the north, holds the key not just to the technical blueprints, but to the moral documentation, the proof that the plagues and famines were sustained by deliberate policy. His moral clarity is the single greatest threat to the Church's legacy of assumed goodness. He must now use his knowledge to strike at the heart of the Soter's economic base, the financial control that the Church maintained through centuries of calculated stagnation. He will use a subtle, ancient mathematical formula, a whisper of the echoes of Alexandria, to introduce financial uncertainty into the stable economy that the cardinals so carefully constructed. His message is ready. It is a carefully worded, coded challenge to the Church's financial secrecy, aimed at the one secular power strong enough to act. We must now analyze his desperate attempt at communication, the unsent letter to Vienna. The most tragic consequence of the Vatican's technological betrayal is not what was burned, but what was lost. The ghost of the steam-powered age, The forbidden blueprints destroyed by the popes represented not just theoretical knowledge, but a fully realized ancient path to a mechanized modern world. The Church's decision to commit moral decay and sustained calculated stagnation killed an entire era of human progress, an age of efficient factories, rapid transport, and advanced medicine that should have dawned centuries earlier. This lost future haunts the present, a perpetual curse of what might have been, a silent steam-powered ghost that proves the popes buried the greatest human revolution in history. This is the truth the Church buried, the sound of a world that never got to turn its gears. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. We move beyond the political debates of the cardinals and into the haunting realm of possibility. Imagine the contrast, the slow, arduous labor of a Renaissance peasant versus the smooth, rhythmic efficiency of a Victorian factory. That gap, that vast chasm of time and suffering, is occupied by the ghost of the steam-powered age, a world of functional clarity that was purposefully unmade by the saviors. The ghost we seek is woven into the surviving fragments of the forbidden blueprints, the intricate gears, the pressure ratios, and the boiler designs discovered by Maestro Andrea and the exiled scholar. They were not mere sketches, they were the fully realized schematics for a mechanized future. Imagine what the world lost, not just a powerful engine, but the ability to mechanize textile production, lifting millions out of repetitive, back-breaking domestic labor. Imagine ships that did not rely on the unpredictable whims of the wind, but on predictable steam power, linking continents with reliable speed, ending the isolation that allowed the calculated stagnation to thrive. The ghost of this age is most tragically felt in the lost revolution of medicine. The steam engine's principles could have immediately led to advanced water pumps and widespread sanitation, the only true answer to the constant cycle of plagues. The burning of the steam blueprints was thus an act of mass murder by inaction, ensuring that the masses remained fearful, supplicating, and dependent on the Church's limited, ineffective spiritual remedies. The fire that still burns is now carried symbolically by the scholar who was retreated to the north. He is the living ember, the final repository of the truth. He understands that the fire must be shared, not with a blaze, but with a whisper. His act of resistance, the unsent letter to Vienna, is the culmination of all the knowledge he preserved. He is using the simple, repeatable mathematical principle of currency assay, drawn from the echoes of Alexandria, to strike at the papacy's economic stability. The beauty of the plan is its simplicity. The formula is easily reproducible. It instantly exposes the fraud of the papal allies, and it can be explained without resorting to any of the complex forbidden engineering schematics. He is fighting the lie of the spectacular false miracle with the quiet certainty of financial truth. If the letter reaches Vienna, it will introduce a fatal flaw into the cardinal's economic system. The gold standard, which upheld the calculated stagnation of the West, will become unstable. Secular powers will gain financial independence from the Church's manipulation, creating the economic stability needed to fund independent scientific inquiry. The moral decay of the Soter will be exposed not as a spiritual necessity, but as a financial shell game. But the danger is immense. The Church's agents, part of the silent agreement of the cardinals, are still hunting for any flicker of the forbidden knowledge. The scholar knows that if the letter is intercepted, it will lead to his immediate destruction and the complete annihilation of the truth he carries. The greatest evidence that the fire still burns lies in the psychological failure of the cardinals. They were so obsessed with destroying the blueprints that they failed to understand that the idea had already begun to propagate. Every time Maestro Andrea built a perfect, hidden water system, every time Brother Thomas cried the truth under the red ink ledger, the truth persisted. The conspiracy was never a complete vacuum. It was always contaminated by the very humanity it sought to control. The fire that still burns is, ultimately, the unresolved philosophical question of the Renaissance. Is man capable of handling his own potential? The Church answered with a resounding no, and imposed centuries of darkness.
The scholar's final act is a single, determined yes. The greatest tragedy is that the Church possessed both the problem and the cure. They held the knowledge of the theological weight of repeatable science, understood its power, and chose the lie of the interventionist God. They chose fear over faith, control over compassion. This is the curse that will forever haunt the library's shadow. Even if the scholar's letter fails, even if the knowledge remains buried for another century, the fire that still burns is the enduring possibility, the knowledge that human progress is not a matter of divine intervention, but of intellectual freedom.
Imagine the final scene, the empty, vast library, magnificent and silent. In the shadowy corner where the books were burned, no physical fire remains. But if you listen closely, you can hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clockwork god, a mechanical certainty that was never truly silenced, waiting patiently for the moment the world chooses to stop praying for miracles and start reading the blueprints. The exiled scholar is the only one who hears that ticking clearly, and his letter is the first whisper of its rhythm to the outside world. We leave him now, in the stillness of the north, the coded letter sealed and ready for delivery. His fate and the fate of the technological revolution rests entirely on the journey of this single, silent piece of vellum. We do not know if it reaches its destination, nor what response it provokes. We only know that the darkness of the lie is now pierced by a faint, persistent light. The fire that still burns in the library's shadow is not merely historical. It is a perpetual reminder of potential. For every generation that followed the Great Purges, the shadow represented a lack, a cultural emptiness that could only be explained by a profound, forgotten loss. Think of the artists of the later Renaissance, attempting feats of perspective and mechanics that seem only almost complete. They had the talent, the ambition, and the philosophical framework, but they lacked the functional calculus, the precise mathematics and metallurgy that had been systematically removed. Their frustrated genius, the sense of hitting an invisible wall of capability, is part of the lingering heat. They were constantly feeling the absence of the ghost of the steam-powered age, a technical clarity that lay just beyond their grasp. Even the Vatican itself wears the scars of the fire. The ancient, untouched sections of the library, now pristine and organized, hide the gaps on the shelves, the empty spaces where the banned Byzantine volumes once rested. These voids are the physical manifestation of the lie, silent accusations against the institution's supposed complete wisdom. The silent agreement of the cardinals ensured that these gaps were never filled with substitute texts. They were left blank, a perpetual memorial to the knowledge that was deemed too dangerous to exist. The most profound element of the fire's endurance is the persistence of the idea of certainty. Even after centuries of propaganda preaching the chaotic, interventionist God, the natural world stubbornly insisted on following the principles of the clockwork God. The stars moved predictably. The tides ebbed and flowed with mathematical regularity. The simple, repeatable logic of 2 + 2 = 4 continued to resonate with human reason. The Vatican could burn the books, but it could not burn mathematics. The fire still burns in the corrupted texts, the ciphers of the hidden index. These volumes, now revered as sacred allegories, contain the dormant formulas, the truths disguised as poetry. Every scholar who reads them risks accidentally discovering the scientific key. The Church's agents must continually monitor the intellectual landscape for any mind that shows too much curiosity about the hidden geometry in the illuminated manuscripts, fearing the moment a scientist uses a prayer book as an engineering manual. The lie requires constant maintenance, proving that the fire is not out, it is merely banked. The persistence of the truth embodied by the exiled scholar's final message remains the greatest threat to the moral decay of the Soter.
The scholar has the final key to unlock the whole archive, the only one who can translate the cold stone of the architect's confession and the poetic language of the corrupted texts. The fire burns in his hand, a small piece of vellum carrying the echoes of Alexandria, ready to ignite the world's awareness. The last chapter of the Vatican's secret history is written not in ink, but in the silence of the North. The fire that still burns in the library's shadow is the realization that the suppression was ultimately futile. You can delay the future, but you cannot destroy it. The crime of the Renaissance papacy will forever stand as the historical definition of intentional technological regression, a sin unique in its malice and scope. We leave the cardinals resting in their tombs, forever bound by their silent agreement, the weight of their moral decay heavy upon the marble. We leave the architect's stone tomb, a silent archive of the steam engine, waiting for the one mind capable of reading its geometry. We leave the Vatican Library, a majestic shell built over the ashes of its own potential. And we return to the scholar, sitting quietly in his exile. He has done all he can do. He has crafted the final challenge, the unsent letter to Vienna, a whisper of mathematics disguised as a philosophical riddle, designed to ignite a revolution without starting a fire. His life's mission, the preservation of the truth against the calculated stagnation, is complete. He is the quiet guardian of the future that was stolen. As the candle flickers low, let your mind drift over the centuries of lost time. Imagine the gentle thrum of the steam-powered world that should have been, the clean cities, the endless light, the predictable certainty of science. That lost world is the final, persistent heat in the library's shadow. It is the hope that endures, waiting for the light of reason to finally penetrate the deliberate darkness. The fire is not out, it is merely sleeping. Rest now. The secret has been told. The truth of the steam and the silence is known. The ghost will wait for the dawn.